You remember Hogwarts as cozy, right? Floating candles, chocolate frogs, everyone almost dying but in a fun way. The thing is, once you actually dig into the lore behind all that, the wizarding world stops looking like a whimsical boarding school fantasy and starts looking like a generational trauma machine held together by propaganda and a handful of very questionable old men. That's what this Dark Lore Iceberg is about. On the surface, you've got the canon everyone knows. Horcruxes are bad, Dementors are spooky, Dumbledore is your wise, slightly chaotic grandpa. But underneath that, buried in interviews, Pottermore articles, companion books, and throwaway lines that you probably skimmed past at age 12, there's a whole other version of this world that is genuinely horrifying once you stop taking it at face value. You might be asking yourself, how deep can this actually go? It's still a kid's series, right? Well, we're going to split it like an iceberg. Top layers first, stuff that's still technically canon or canon adjacent, where you don't have to take my word for it because Rowling literally said it somewhere. Later parts, we start drifting into contradictions, cut concepts, fan theories, and almost creepypasta territory where the implications get uncomfortable. In this video, we're staying in that upper band of the iceberg, but it's already rough. We'll talk soul magic and Horcrux mechanics, where a Horcrux isn't just hide your soul in a locket. It's more like spiritual self-amputation. Rowling has said it takes a supremely evil act beyond murder, which means Voldemort is doing rituals so dark the books won't even describe them. If you're like me, that retroactively makes every scene with that diary feel about 10 times worse. We're also diving into Obscurials, which are basically weaponized child abuse. Kids so traumatized they suppress their magic until it explodes and starts killing people. Then you've got ancient wizarding wars and purges, Dementors that literally breed in despair and multiply during wars, cursed objects, blood magic, unforgivables, the taboo on Voldemort's name, and post-war cover-ups where the Ministry quietly turns a torture fortress full of soul-eating monsters into their official prison and calls it justice. I mean, come on. Along the way, I'm going to poke at your childhood comfort characters a bit. Dementors might be man-made horrors adopted as state tools. Blood protection on Privet Drive. That's blood magic, the same principle Voldemort hijacks when he takes Harry's blood. And Dumbledore is not your grandpa. He's closer to the guy running a morally dubious long con and hoping the child soldier survives. In case you've forgotten, our sources here are the books first, then Rowling interviews, Pottermore/Wizarding World articles, and when we get to fan theories or fandom urban legends, I'll flag them clearly. And the wild part? Even the kid-friendly stuff at the very top of this iceberg, like how Hogwarts is run and how the Ministry works, already has deeply disturbing implications once you stop assuming the adults know what they're doing. That's where we're starting. So let's actually talk about this iceberg, because it's not just a cute graphic with spooky labels. It's a map of how far we're going to push the Harry Potter universe before it stops feeling like cozy childhood nostalgia and starts feeling like a war crimes tribunal with wands. At the very top, you've got the stuff everybody knows. Movie-only fans, people who skimmed the books once, your aunt who calls him Harry Potters. That's the surface. Horcruxes exist. Dumbledore is wise. Dementors are bad. Voldemort doesn't have a nose. Safe trivia. Quidditch rules. Chocolate frog cards. Nothing that keeps you up at night. Right under that, we hit what I'll call the shallow deep. If you're like me and you read the books until they literally fell apart, this is where all the extra detail lives. Pottermore/Wizarding World bios, timelines, the bit about Azkaban originally being a fortress run by a dark wizard whose experiments attracted Dementors. We're still mostly in canon, But we're starting to notice that the wizard prison is basically a torture island someone repurposed for administrative convenience. Then we get to mid-depth. This is where you might be asking yourself, wait, did we ever actually see that in the books? And the answer is no. That came from a random interview in 2007. Stuff like Rowling saying a Horcrux needs a supremely evil act beyond murder, or that Dementors breed in despair and multiply during wars. This is where timeline weirdness, offhand comments, and half-remembered quotes start quietly rewriting how bad things really were. And finally, the abyss. Down here, we're going to take all of that and ask, if this is true in-universe, what else has to be true? This is fan synthesis, disturbing but logical extrapolation, and the uncomfortable gaps. Obscurials as magical trauma cases, Ariana Dumbledore and Credence as maybe not coincidences, blood wards on Privet Drive being the same kind of magic Voldemort hijacks with Harry's blood. You don't have to take my word for it. We'll walk through the chain of logic. Quick content boundaries before we dive. We're not doing real-world gore. We're not doing explicit NSFW. But we are going to talk plainly about murder, war crimes, child abuse, and soul mutilation. Because, come on, that's literally the main plot device. Horcruxes are magical self-dismemberment. Azkaban is a state-sanctioned depression factory. We're not going to pretend that's wholesome. In terms of what counts, rule of thumb, if it's in the books, it's canon. If it's on Pottermore or Wizarding World, it's semi-canon. Interviews are author intent. Fandom ideas, clearly labeled theory. Rowling's out-of-text comments sit in that messy middle. We'll use them when they clarify mechanics and call them out when they feel like retroactive patching. For the first 15 sections, we're mostly skating the surface, shallow deep, and mid-depth, setting up soul magic, obscurials, and the darker corners of wizarding history so the really abyssal stuff later doesn't feel like pure fan fiction. And if the explainable layers already feel morally rotten to you, you might not be ready for what this series ends up suggesting about Dumbledore, the Ministry, and what actually happens after the killing curse hits. So before we dive into soul magic, obscurials, and all the really cursed stuff, we need to admit something kind of uncomfortable. The wizarding world is already a horror setting on the default difficulty. Like, this is the baseline. This is what everyone is fine with. Take Hogwarts. You might be asking yourself, isn't that the cozy castle with chocolate frogs and moving staircases? Yeah, about those staircases. In case you've forgotten, they literally rearrange themselves under groups of 11-year-olds who do not know how gravity works yet. The building has murder stairs, sentient murder trees, and a forbidden forest that is basically a magical OSHA violation. And the response from staff is, "Don't go in there, kids." And then they assign detention, in there. And that's before we get to the sports. Quidditch is a game where children fly at highway speeds on wooden sticks while cannonballs try to knock them into comas. Broken arms, concussions, multiple near-death falls? That's just Saturday. Lethal magical creatures live on campus. Giant spiders, a basilisk one year, a three-headed dog another. Come on, my middle school banned dodgeball for being too intense. Because trauma here is just background noise. Students watch a teacher get possessed by Voldemort, see Cedric's corpse appear out of thin air, get tortured by Caros, or literally experience the Dementor's kiss light on the Hogwarts Express, and the institutional response is, go to the hospital wing, have a chocolate, you'll be fine. No counselors, no long-term care, not even, hey Harry, you relive your parents' murder every time you hear screaming. Maybe let's unpack that. And this isn't just individual negligence. It's structural. If you're like me, you read Harry's cupboard years ago and thought, surely the magical adults fix this. They don't. Dumbledore clocks that Harry is abused and leaves him there because the blood wards are useful. Tom Riddle grows up in a Muggle orphanage, clearly disturbed, clearly magical, and the two most powerful wizards who notice him, Dumbledore and later Slughorn, don't get him therapy. They get him a scholarship. And then, basically, a research assistantship in experimental soul mutilation. Zoom out to the Ministry. These are people who will memory wipe an entire street because a snake got loose, quietly cover up mass casualties, and run Aurors as a kind of magical secret police with wands, lethal spells, and almost zero oversight. Fudge tries to have Harry expelled and his wand snapped on the spot. That's not a bug. That's how the system is supposed to work. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at the legal system we do see. No lawyers. Trials where the accused is chained to a chair in a pit surrounded by hostile judges. And the main prison? An island guarded by soul-eating wraiths that the Ministry just casually employs as state security. They have a recorded history of throwing people in Azkaban without proper trials, and when they realize, the fix is, whoops. At that point, are the dark arts really a separate category, or are they just the logical extension of how this society already operates? The same culture that thinks Dementors are a reasonable perimeter defense also invents Horcruxes, blood wards, taboo curses, and all the fun post-mortem surprises we're going to get into. And if this is what counts as normal, you kind of have to ask, what gets labeled truly forbidden here? And what are they so scared you'll figure out? So if this whole society is already running on casual cruelty, we kind of need to ask a basic question before we go any deeper. What is a soul actually doing in Harry Potter? The books never give us a neat textbook answer, but they do quietly act like souls are just real. Not a metaphor, not a belief system. They can be split, damaged, yanked out, and they apparently hang around as ghosts or weird echoes. You get nearly headless Nick choosing to stay, you get Voldemort stapling chunks of himself to random antiques, and you get the Dementor's kiss, which is the state-sponsored version of hitting uninstall on your consciousness. Now, you might be asking yourself, aren't all of those just spirits? And this is where the series is sneakily specific. A soul is your core self. A spirit is more like a post-mortem projection. And then you've got magical residue, which is the really cursed stuff. Tom Riddle's diary isn't a ghost. It's a pre-recorded shard of soul with just enough processing power to gaslight a 12-year-old. Voldemort's wraith form after Godric's Hollow. That's a mutilated soul fragment clinging to life. Nick, on the other hand, is translucent but intact. He remembers his death. He has regrets. He's not trying to possess your homework. If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking magic was just waving a wand and yelling fake Latin. But the series keeps hinting that magic is tied to whatever this soul life force thing is, not just your physical body. Wands choose the wizard based on the core, and those cores are literally pieces of magical creatures' innermost selves. The killing curse doesn't burn you or blast you apart. It just slams straight into that essence and turns the lights off. No mark, no drama, just spiritual hard stop. So let's talk soul integrity. Most witches and wizards never mess with it. They duel, they hex. They occasionally turn each other into slugs, but they're not intentionally ripping their own selves to pieces. Dark magic is what happens when you decide your soul is a resource to be mined. You damage it on purpose, for power, for fake immortality, for control over other people's inner lives. Horcruxes are the obvious example, but they're just the most extreme version of a pattern that's everywhere. Take Dementors. In case you've forgotten, they don't just eat happiness like sad Roombas. The kiss removes the soul entirely and leaves the body breathing, legally alive, but mentally gone. That means the ministry knows souls are concrete enough to be extracted and files that under acceptable punishment. I mean, come on. You don't have to take my word for it. They literally keep a species around whose entire business model is spiritual annihilation. And once you accept that souls can be split, eaten, and anchored to objects, the afterlife in this world gets really sketchy, really fast. Where do the pieces go? Who's responsible for what if half of you is in a ring and half is screaming in a diary? That's the unsettling backdrop for Obscurials, for Horcruxes, for every curse that feeds on trauma. We're going to zoom in on those next, but just keep this in mind. In this universe, the darkest magic is the stuff that runs on spiritual harm, and it almost always starts with someone vulnerable paying the price. So when I say magic that runs on spiritual harm, you might be asking yourself, okay, but what's the premium version of that? What's the darkest thing you can do to a soul in this universe that already has Dementors and child weaponization baked in? That would be the Horcrux. In case you've forgotten the in-universe definition, a Horcrux is basically an external hard drive for your soul, an object that contains a fragment of a witch or wizard's soul, anchoring them to life so they can't fully die while it exists. Kill the body, sure, but as long as that object survives, the person is still alive, in a horrible, disembodied way, waiting to claw back a body. The basic recipe is simple and awful. Step 1. Commit murder. Not self-defense, not an accident, but cold-blooded killing, because in this setting, murder literally rips the soul. Step 2. Use a separate, deliberately unspecified ritual to grab that torn-off piece and weld it into some object. Rowling has said that ritual is a supremely evil act beyond the murder itself, and she refused to describe it on the page, which, I mean, come on. In a series that gives us detailed bone-regrowing scenes, that's saying something. And it's not like you walk away with a neat little 50-50 split. Rowling's also clear that making a Horcrux causes permanent, irrevocable mutilation to the soul. You're not just dividing it like a pizza, you're damaging the original, scarring whatever's left inside your body. Do that once and you're spiritually maimed forever. Do that 7 times like Voldemort and you're pretty much choosing to stop being a person. If you're like me, you probably noticed the side effects way before Dumbledore explains any of this. The more Horcruxes Voldemort makes, the less human he looks and acts. His face flattens, his eyes go red, his voice gets snakier, and his capacity for empathy drops through the floor. That's not just aesthetic villain branding. It's the physical and psychological fallout of repeatedly violating your own soul. You don't just lose your nose, you lose any remaining ability to see other people as real. And the soul fragments themselves aren't inert. Horcruxes are semi-sentient, and they behave like really nasty parasites. Tom Riddle's diary doesn't just play back memories. It talks, manipulates, and literally possesses Ginny. The locket whispers your worst fears, defends itself, and tries to turn the trio against each other. These things can influence minds, lash out, and in some cases act independently of their creator's current goals. What's wild is how taboo this is even for dark wizards. Slughorn, who is not exactly a moral icon, is terrified to even say the word Horcrux, and Voldemort's decision to make multiple is unprecedented enough that Dumbledore has to reverse engineer it from context clues and Tom's weird obsession with the number 7. The moral horror here is that immortality isn't just, I don't want to die. It's, I'm okay living as a permanently broken, less human thing if it means I win. And you don't have to take my word for it. Rowling explicitly frames it as worse than death. But if this is the official red line everyone agrees is too far, what about the gray area soul magic the so-called good guys quietly use when it's convenient? That's where things start to look a lot less black and white. So let's talk about what it actually costs to do that kind of soul surgery, because Rowling doesn't leave this at, oh no, my feelings. She said flat out that making a Horcrux damages your soul beyond repair, and that Voldemort's post-mortem state is something less than the meanest ghost. Not a cool phantom. Not a tragic specter. Just a shredded remnant that can't even manage proper haunting. You might be asking yourself, okay, but murder already rips the soul, right? What's different here? And that's where it starts to feel like the series is hinting at a cosmic moral law. Killing someone tears your soul accidentally, as a side effect of doing something horrible, but a Horcrux is you looking at that tear and going, perfect. I'm going to bottle this and turn it into my immortality plan. It's not just evil, it's industrialized evil. Rowling even said the ritual requires a supremely evil act beyond murder, which we never see on page. So every time Voldemort makes one of these, he's not only splitting his soul, he's training himself to treat that split as normal. If you're like me, you start wondering what that does to his basic perception of reality. Love, remorse, guilt, even simple empathy are all soul-based in this universe. You carve off enough pieces, and you're not just uglier and snakier. You literally stop being able to experience those things the way a human does. And that's just his main chunk. What about the pieces? Each Horcrux is a fragment of Voldemort that can think and react. Diary Riddle is a full-on teenager with opinions. So imagine being that shard, trapped in a locket, a diary, a ring, stuffed into a snake or, accidentally stapled to a baby's forehead. You don't age, you don't move. You just sit in cursed metal while people wear you to tea parties, and you whisper nightmares at them. I mean, come on. That sounds like eternal conscious claustrophobia, which creates a nasty ethical problem nobody in the books wants to look at too closely. To defeat Voldemort, you have to annihilate those fragments, and the methods are brutal. Basilisk venom, fiend fire, the sword of Gryffindor soaking up both. You're not just cracking an object, you might be torturing a sentient soul slice out of existence. Are we okay with magical euthanasia by corrosive snake poison? The story kind of shrugs and goes, hey war. And all of this loops back to Voldemort's core flaw. He's so terrified of death, he chooses something arguably worse. The wizarding world gives him nothing better. They have no healthy framework for mortality, just Dementors, ghosts stuck in limbo, and people refusing to say the word dead. In case you've forgotten, the one guy saying, "Death is the next great adventure," is also the guy grooming a child to become a walking Horcrux detector, and, eventually, a willing sacrifice. You don't have to take my word for it. We're going to dig into that Dumbledore mess later. But if dark magic can permanently mutilate a soul, what does that say about all the other soul-adjacent spells the good side throws around without blinking? Patronus messages, memory wipes, blood wards, love protections. How safe is any of that, really? So let's talk about the weirdest thing in this supposedly kid-friendly series. The most powerful light magic we ever see is literally powered by a woman getting murdered in front of her baby. In case you've forgotten, Lily doesn't just accidentally die. She's given a way out. Voldemort tells her to stand aside multiple times, and she consciously chooses not to. That willing choice to die for Harry triggers what Dumbledore calls ancient magic, and what the fandom has basically branded as love armor. The killing curse hits her, but instead of just killing her, that death imprints onto Harry. It leaves a mark on his soul, not just his forehead. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just heartwarming? It's love, right? And yeah, thematically it's gorgeous. Mechanically, it is soul interference. We're watching a death event rewrite the metaphysical rules for another person. Harry becomes coated in Lily's final act, like a permanent, invisible shield baked into his very being. That's not, aw, cute. That's, congratulations, your mom's ghost feelings are now a firewall. And Dumbledore looks at that and goes, cool, what if we industrialize it? He takes the protection and extends it with blood wards. Petunia shares Lily's blood, so if Harry lives in Petunia's house, the protection is anchored to that physical space, not to affection, not to bedtime stories, to DNA and a postal address. While you can still call home the place where your mother's blood dwells is a sweet line until you remember the home. In question is a cupboard under the stairs. This is where it gets creepy. Harry's cosmic safety net is contingent on living with people who emotionally abuse him, because the magic cares about blood, not actual love. If you're like me, you read those early chapters as kind of exaggerated sitcom cruelty the first time. On a reread, it's like, no, this kid is being starved and gaslit so a blood spell stays charged. I mean, come on. And that blood stuff is everywhere once you start looking. Blood seals, unbreakable vows. Ancient wards are keyed to family lines. Voldemort's resurrection ritual needs blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. And Rowling has said that decision lets Harry keep carrying Lily's protection even after Voldemort uses his blood. The story is quietly yelling, blood is a magical conduit, not just red plot juice. So if love and sacrifice can bind a protection to a soul, is there really a clean mechanical line between that and binding a soul fragment to a Horcrux object? One is framed as the ultimate good, the other as the ultimate evil, but under the hood, they're both hacking souls with ritualized violence. And Dumbledore, he knows exactly what he's doing. He leaves Harry in that environment for a decade, prioritizing the stability of a blood-based protection over the kid's mental health. You don't have to take my word for it. We're going to dig into his long game later, but this is our first big example of light characters using the same soul and blood mechanics as dark wizards, just with way better PR. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because the next step down this iceberg is what happens when you don't just mess with blood and souls in people, you start baking that stuff into things. Cursed objects in Harry Potter aren't just, ow, that hurt prank items. Broadly, we're talking anything intentionally enchanted to harm you, control you, or kind of latch on like a magical parasite. Some are basically weaponized bad vibes, some are semi-sentient, and some sit in a dusty box for decades, waiting for the exact right victim, like the world's worst loot crate. Take the opal necklace at Borgin and Burke's. In case you've forgotten, it's been responsible for the death of 19 Muggle owners to date, which is a wild sales pitch. Then you've got Katie Bell's cursed package in Half-Blood Prince, where she barely brushes it and immediately starts screaming and levitating. That's not just pain. That's an enchantment that hijacks your nervous system and tries to pilot you into an early grave. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, how smart are these things? Because Marvolo Gaunt's ring doesn't just kill Dumbledore slowly, it tempts him first, using the resurrection stone like bait. The locket Horcrux goes even further. It doesn't just sit there being evil, it actively amplifies fear, despair, and insecurity, then feeds on the fallout. It's like if your worst intrusive thoughts unionized and got a jewelry sponsorship. And notice how often this stuff is keyed to identity. The diary responds to Ginny, the ring to the Gaunt bloodline. The locket works extra well on people already racked with guilt. A lot of dark enchantments look like they're running off magical contracts and taboos, bound to names, bloodlines, specific actions. Say the wrong word, touch with the wrong blood, break the wrong rule, and the spell wakes up. Once you see that pattern, blood magic stops feeling rare and starts feeling like the operating system. Blood isn't just fuel, it's ID. The unbreakable vow literally tattoos a promise into your life force. Voldemort's resurrection soup in Goblet of Fire uses Harry's blood to hack Lily's protection and keep that ward from ever working against him again. You don't have to take my word for it. The text has him explicitly gloating about taking Harry's blood into myself. Which brings us to maybe the creepiest, everyday dark spell, the taboo on Voldemort's name. Say Voldemort out loud, and the spell pings your location, shreds any protective enchantments around you, and dispatches snatchers like a magical SWAT team. It's not just a jinx, it's a surveillance network weaponizing language itself and punishing anyone who refuses to play along with euphemisms like you-know-who. I mean, come on, that's literally thought crime enforced by spell. And the scariest part? This proves the wizarding world has the tech for mass surveillance and precision-targeted curses, and just, mostly, doesn't use it. Until fascists take power, at which point, suddenly, the infrastructure appears overnight. Keep that in mind when we head to Azkaban next, because systemic, infrastructural dark magic is exactly the vibe when you start asking where Dementors came from and why the Ministry was so eager to move in. So, yeah. After magical surveillance capitalism, where do you go? You go to the place where the government literally weaponizes depression. Welcome to Azkaban, home of the Dementors, where criminal justice is just soul-flavored all-you-can-eat. In case you've forgotten, Dementors have one job. They feed on human happiness. They move in, the temperature drops, the lights go out, and suddenly every good memory you've ever had feels fake. They don't just make you sad, they strip you down to raw despair until you're convinced you'll never be okay again. And if they really want to commit, they perform the Dementor's kiss, which is not romantic, not French, and involves sucking your soul out through your mouth permanently. That's not metaphor. In this universe, the soul is a real, detachable thing. The kiss doesn't kill your body, it empties it. You're left breathing, technically alive, but the person is gone. The books straight up call it worse than death, because at least death has some kind of afterlife. This is just permanent shutdown. They're also walking environmental hazards, cold, rot, fog, that creeping sense that the room is getting smaller. All Dementor vibes. Even very powerful wizards can't just tank that. You need specialized magic, the Patronus charm. Not a shield, not a curse, but weaponized joy. If you're like me, you probably tried to cast one in your bedroom at age 12 and just ended up shouting Expecto Patronum at your closet. Now you might be asking yourself, where do these things come from? Rowling has said they arise in places of intense, long-term misery. And then she casually mentions a fortress island where a dark wizard experimented on muggles. The place became saturated with despair, and Dementors just showed up. That's Azkaban before it was a prison. The Ministry didn't build a humane facility, and then it went wrong. They found a magical Chernobyl of human suffering and moved in. And they didn't just tolerate the Dementors. They hired them. Hey, you eat happiness and occasionally souls? Want a government contract? The entire security model of Azkaban is lock people in with creatures that literally feed on their torment. The kiss is even a legal sentence. No real public debate, just, yeah, for some crimes we let monsters annihilate your consciousness. Paperwork's over there. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at the First War. Suspected Death Eaters get chucked into Azkaban with minimal trials. Some of them kissed on what's basically vibes and fear. This is a society that knows souls exist, has seen what Horcruxes do, and still decides state-sanctioned soul removal is on the table. Which ties Dementors straight into soul magic. They're like the natural endpoint of the same metaphysics that make Horcruxes and the killing curse possible. Magic that treats identity as a manipulable object. Voldemort hacks the system with rituals. Dementors are the system, a kind of ambient, self-replicating dark magic that breeds in war and despair. And the creepiest part? Azkaban's origin story with that nameless dark wizard and his experiments is barely sketched in. We're going to dig into that next, because once you ask what exactly was happening on that island before the Ministry showed up, the present-day horror starts to look like the cleaned-up version. So, Azkaban, as we know it, is already nightmare fuel. But the cleaned-up version? That's the wild part. Because if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, what exactly do you have to do to a random rock in the ocean to make it permanently sad? Originally, Azkaban wasn't a prison at all. It was basically one guy's evil bachelor pad. Rowling's extra lore talks about a dark wizard, probably named Acrisdis, who built a hidden fortress on that island and just went to town. We're talking horrific experiments on muggles, rituals that never get spelled out, the kind of stuff the books politely pan the camera away from. When he finally vanished, the island didn't go quiet. It curdled. Dementors and other things started gathering there like vultures around roadkill. Early Ministry records? They pretty much pretend the island doesn't exist. Officials knew something was out there, but nobody wanted to sail into a cloud of psychic depression and screaming ghosts. In case you've forgotten, Dementors breed in despair and chaos, and this place had centuries of it soaked into the stones. By the time the Ministry actually looked, the island was already a feeding ground, a kind of magical landfill of suffering. Now here's the real moral high ground moment. Faced with this seething dark hotspot, did the Ministry say, "We should cleanse this, study it, maybe figure out what went wrong so it never happens again?" Absolutely not. They said, "Oh cool, the Dementors are already there. Free security." I mean, come on. That's like finding a haunted, blood-stained mansion and deciding it would make an affordable daycare. You don't have to take my word for it. The official story is that they chose Azkaban precisely because the Dementors were already in residence. Instead of confronting what Acrisdis did, they just built their entire justice system on top of it. That's not just lazy, that's structurally evil. It tells you a lot about wizarding priorities that Blacksite, powered by despair ghosts, beat humane prison in the budget meeting. And whatever happened there originally was big. We're going to assume Acrisdis wasn't just tossing around random jinxes. This feels like ancient, industrial-scale dark magic. The kind that leaves scars on places. We've seen smaller versions. The Forbidden Forest crawling with cursed creatures. Battlefields like the Department of Mysteries still echoing with weirdness. The Room of Requirement literally warped and toxic after Fiendfire. Azkaban is that idea turned up to 11. Which raises the creepiest possibility of all. What if Dementors aren't a natural species at all? What if they're a byproduct of extreme, sustained human misery, like magical pollution congealed into predators? Man-made horrors, in the most literal sense. If one fortress of despair can spawn or attract an entire colony, how many other places like this existed in older wars, older empires, older cover-ups? And if Azkaban is just the one we know about, how many more dark sites have been scrubbed from the maps, quietly buried, or repurposed into something that looks harmless on the surface? So if Azkaban is just the one horror fortress we know about, what did earlier wars look like when nobody was even pretending to care about rights? Let's talk about the part of wizarding history that gets hand-waved as giant wars and werewolf problems, when what we're really looking at is ethnic cleansing with wands. Giants first. In case you've forgotten, Hagrid doesn't go on a fun cultural exchange in Order of the Phoenix. He walks into the aftermath of centuries of organized campaigns where wizards literally drove giants out of Europe, up mountains, into tiny freezing valleys where food is scarce and everything wants to kill you. The books casually mention that many giants were killed off in earlier conflicts, but if you're like me, you read that now and go, okay, that sounds less like battlefield casualties and more like systematic hunting. And yeah, giants are portrayed as violent and brutal. I mean, come on, they're introduced as skull-crushing, rock-throwing boss mobs, but we're also told they used to have complex tribal structures, leaders, rules, all that stuff, and those keep collapsing as their numbers shrink. When every contact with humans ends in death squads and relocation, how long before attack first becomes the only cultural value that still keeps you alive? Wizards point at that and go, see, they're savages, while quietly ignoring who lit the match. Werewolves are the same pattern, just smaller and stuck with a human face most of the month. You might be asking yourself, why do so many of the werewolves we meet side with Voldemort? Well, the Ministry has an entire stack of discriminatory laws that make it nearly impossible for them to live normally. We hear about employment bans, registration requirements, landlords refusing them housing, parents pulling kids from schools. Lupin literally cannot hold a job because someone might complain. When you can't work, can't rent, and every full moon is a crime waiting to happen, who shows up? Dark factions offering food, protection, and the chance to bite back. The Ministry points to Fenrir Greyback and goes, look at these monsters, while their own policies are pretty much manufacturing desperation on an industrial scale. They deny resources and integration, then use the inevitable isolated incidents as proof that crackdowns were justified all along. And giants and werewolves aren't even the whole picture. Goblins have a long, bloody history of rebellions that gets reduced to a couple of throwaway jokes about goblin uprisings in history of magic. House elves are magically shackled servants whose entire oppression is played as background flavor and comic relief. You don't have to take my word for it. Hermione literally starts a one-girl labor movement, and everyone treats her like she's having a weird phase. When you zoom out, what you see is systemic racism and near-genocidal policy baked into the foundations of the wizarding world. Voldemort's blood purity thing isn't some brand new evil. It's just the mask ripped off, an extreme version of prejudices the Ministry already enforces in nicer robes. And here's the really fun part. We're going to find out that most of this ugliness barely exists in Hogwarts education at all. What happens when the people writing the history books are the same ones who wrote the laws? So when you've got that kind of baked-in prejudice running the show, what does an actual wizarding war look like? Not the kid-friendly highlight reel we get in the books, but the real thing people like McGonagall and Lupin are clearly having flashbacks about. Because in case you've forgotten, the first wizarding war is basically treated like set dressing. It's background trauma. It's an excuse for why every adult over 30 looks permanently tired. We hear about it in fragments, in throwaway comments, in one-line obituaries. But we almost never see it. No detailed battles. No timeline. No real sense of what day-to-day life under Voldemort actually felt like. We do get hints, and they're nasty. Widespread terror. People disappearing in the night. Giants recruited. Werewolves turned loose. Death Eaters inside the Ministry, inside Hogwarts, inside supposedly safe institutions. The whole vibe is that nowhere was really safe, and if you're like me, you read that as, this was not a clean good versus evil war. This was a slow, paranoid, everyone is watching their neighbors kind of collapse. And then look at what happens the second Voldemort falls. Azkaban suddenly fills up with Death Eaters. That implies a massive wave of arrests and trials. Or, more likely, a lot of, you were in the mask. We have your dark mark. Enjoy the Dementors. How many of those people actually got a fair hearing? Did the Wizengamot carefully investigate every case during a national panic? I mean, come on. Sitting over all of this is Dumbledore, de facto resistance leader, moral compass, and also the guy who tells Harry basically none of the details. We don't know what deals he cut, what compromises he made, who he agreed to spare in exchange for information. You might be asking yourself why the supposed greatest wizard of the age leaves such a tiny paper trail for the most important war of the century. It's either terrible record-keeping, or someone really didn't want the full story written down. Then you've got the Order of the Phoenix, which is literally a private militia operating outside official channels. They do covert missions, sabotage, intelligence work, all the spy movie stuff. But the books never linger on what that actually looks like. Did they use memory charms on witnesses? Did they stage accidents? How many mysterious explosions in the Muggle news were actually botched Order operations? Once you remember how casually the series treats memory charms, Lockhart, wiping people's lives, the Ministry altering Muggle memories, Death Eaters cleaning up after attacks, you have to wonder how many civilian casualties just got edited out of history. You don't have to take my word for it. The canon already shows Fudge leaning on cover-ups during the Second War. Why would the first one be cleaner? And then, after all that, a ton of Death Eaters wriggle out of punishment by claiming they were imperious, and the Ministry kind of lets them. That screams, we do not want to pull this thread. Dig too deep, and you're going to find collaborators in very awkward places. So the real horror of the first Wizarding War might not be the duels we never see, but the way the Wizarding world chose to remember it. Selectively, strategically, and maybe with a lot of obliviots. Which raises another question we're going to have to poke at. If memories can be rewritten that easily, how much of Wizarding history is actually real? If memories are that easy to scrub, you might be asking yourself, what happens when you can't rewrite the past, so the magic tries to rewrite you instead? Welcome to Obscurials, which are basically what you get when childhood trauma and raw magic shake hands and say, let's ruin everything. In case you've forgotten the Fantastic Beasts lore because, you know, life happened. An Obscurial is a young witch or wizard who's been forced to violently suppress their magic, not hide it a bit. We're talking years of fear, beatings, religious panic, or cultural pressure so intense that the child pushes their own magic down like a beach ball underwater. That pressure builds a separate, parasitic dark force inside them called an Obscurus, which is one of the most metal and depressing concepts the series ever gives us. When that Obscurus finally breaks out, it doesn't look like a spell. It's more like a living tantrum made of smoke, shrapnel, and pure, unfocused rage. It tears through streets, shreds buildings, snaps necks, and then vanishes. Often the host dies in the process, sometimes without a body left to mourn, which is convenient if you're a ministry official who doesn't want awkward questions about, hey, why did this magical kid literally explode? Newt Scamander notes that Obscurials usually die before age 10. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't an instant curse, it's a slow, lethal side effect of chronic trauma in magical children. You don't just wake up with an Obscurus because you had one bad day. You get one because every day has been bad, and you've learned that your survival depends on pretending you're not magical. And the wizarding world knows about this. Historically, they have records, case studies, even a classified suitcase sample. But the way they talk about Obscurials is like, oh, tragic, rare anomalies, instead of, wow, this is what happens when we abandon magical kids to abusive muggle families and extremist communities. I mean, come on, if you're like me, you read that and think, this is not a rare bug. This is a feature of systemic neglect. Obscurials are also soul-adjacent horror. They're not Horcruxes, but they're another way a person's magical essence gets twisted and weaponized by suffering. With Horcruxes, you tear your soul on purpose. With an Obscurus, the world tears it for you, and your magic learns to hit back. And of course, instead of fixing the conditions that create them, people study them. Newt tries to help, but even his notes are basically, here's how this child-destroying parasite behaves. Grindelwald goes full supervillain and treats Obscurials as living weapons. You don't have to take my word for it. He literally spends an entire movie gaslighting Credence into being a nuke with feelings. Which raises a really uncomfortable question. How many potential Obscurials did Hogwarts-era Britain quietly lose? Harry under the Dursleys, if the abuse had been just a bit worse. Ariana Dumbledore, whose magic exploded after an attack. How many unnamed kids just never made it to Hogwarts letters? We're going to dig into those specific cases next. Ariana, Credence, and the eerie pattern of suppressed magic incidents that might point to a much bigger, older problem baked into wizarding history. So let's talk about the most cursed family secret in the series that isn't locked in a locket. Ariana Dumbledore. If you're like me, you probably read her backstory as tragic side lore on your first pass and kept moving. But once Fantastic Beasts drops Obscurials on the table, suddenly that little side story looks like a case file. In case you've forgotten, Ariana is 6, doing accidental magic in the garden when a group of Muggle boys see her. They attack her for being a freak. She's traumatized so badly, she basically breaks. After that, her magic stops coming out in cute little bursts and starts erupting in violent, uncontrollable episodes. The family hides her. Kendra moves them to Godric's Hollow, and for years Ariana swings between eerie calm and terrifying outbursts until that final three-way duel with Albus, Aberforth, and Grindelwald, where a stray curse kills her. Now go watch an Obscurial scene from Fantastic Beasts and tell me that doesn't ring a bell. We're talking magic that won't express normally, long periods where it looks like it's gone, and then sudden destructive explosions that level rooms and hurt people nearby. Ariana smashes a floor, attacks her own mother by accident, and is described as unbalanced and dangerous. Credence Barebone literally turns into a cloud of shredding dark force that wrecks half of New York. Same pattern, different century. So the big theory is simple. Ariana was basically an early, undocumented Obscurial. Her magic, crushed by trauma and constant suppression, turned inward, creating this parasitic, bottled-up force that made her a walking magical time bomb. You might be asking yourself, okay, But why didn't anyone in the books just say the word Obscurial? Because Rowling hadn't invented it yet. But inside the story, it actually tracks that this would be obscure, rare, and heavily covered up, especially in a respectable family. Enter Credence. He grows up in a magic-hating, almost cult-like household with Mary Lou Barebone, gets beaten for any sign of power, and develops an Obscurus that Grindelwald immediately tries to weaponize. Compare that to Ariana, attacked for magic, then basically cloistered, while Grindelwald is literally living in her house as a teen, sniffing around the Dumbledore siblings and dreaming of world domination. I mean, come on, the guy has a type. If Ariana was an Obscurial, that rewires Albus. He doesn't just grow up with a sick sister. He grows up with a barely controlled magical catastrophe in the next room, caused by Muggle violence, family secrecy, and his own neglect when he runs off with Grindelwald. His obsession with secrecy, his guilt, and that almost pathological reluctance to face Grindelwald later? You don't have to take my word for it. It all reads heavier if he knows exactly what Grindelwald was playing with under his roof. And yeah, the Credence is a Dumbledore stuff is a continuity car crash. I don't know where you've been. But thematically, Ariana and Obscurials are welded together for most fans. Which raises one really nasty question. If Obscurials are a known thing, how many tragic accidents in pure-blood family trees were actually kids whose magic turned lethal under pressure? So once you notice that pattern with Ariana and Obscurials, it gets really hard to unsee how much of wizarding society runs on weaponized childhood trauma. Hogwarts isn't just a school with a few quirky safety violations. It's kind of a factory that takes already damaged kids and forges them into exactly what the system needs. In case you've forgotten, our main hero shows up having spent a decade in an abusive cupboard situation. Harry is literally malnourished, hyper-vigilant, and used to being screamed at for existing. Neville's parents? Tortured into insanity with the Cruciatus curse, leaving him raised by a grandmother who loves him, but also constantly reminds him he's not his dad. Ariana has a complete magical breakdown after a Muggle attack. Credence is beaten, repressed, turned into a living bomb. These aren't rare exceptions. These are the kids the narrative actually follows. What does that say about the baseline? Now drop those kids into Hogwarts, where Year 1 includes a mountain troll in the bathroom and a 3-headed dog. Year 2 has a basilisk stalking the plumbing. Later, we get Dementors on campus, full Death Eater invasions, and a literal war in the hallways. And how many scenes do we get of actual long-term psychological support? No therapists, no counselors, just off you go, back to class, maybe have some chocolate. I mean, come on, even the Marauders generation got werewolf maulings and a child soldier war as their graduation present. You might be asking yourself why that matters magically. In this world, trauma doesn't just hurt your feelings, it rewires your spellcasting. Strong emotions amplify magic. Accidental magic explodes out of kids when they're terrified or furious. And if you repress it hard enough for long enough, you risk going obscurial. That's literally magic turning inwards and eating you alive. At the same time, the adults are very happy to harness that volatility when it's convenient. Angry kid? Great duelist material. Scared kid? Perfect recruit. Because the system benefits, traumatized children are easier to slot into roles. Chosen One, Auror, Death Eater, Order Member. If you're like me, you can't stop noticing how often adults frame this as destiny instead of grooming. Dumbledore especially has a pattern. He leaves Harry with abusive relatives to power blood wards, lets him face trolls, dragons, Voldemort. Then, reluctantly, allows the DA to become an unsanctioned combat training program. You don't have to take my word for it. The man literally admits he was raising Harry like a pig for slaughter. Tie that to soul magic, and it gets nastier. We're told Horcruxes require a murder plus some extra ritual we never fully see, but repeated exposure to killing curses, Dementors, dark artifacts, all that stuff clearly erodes empathy. You don't have to literally split your soul for it to get thinner around the edges. And the line between dark wizards and good ones starts to look like who gets institutional backing. Death Eaters, Aurors, Order of the Phoenix. They're all drawing from the same pool of trauma-saturated teenagers. So if this is what the system does to kids in public, on school grounds, with teachers watching, what does it look like when the ministry starts hiding things? What kind of experiments, cover-ups, and quiet little moral disasters are buried in sealed files and vanished fortresses we barely hear about? So if the ministry is already casually traumatizing kids on school grounds, you might be asking yourself, what does it look like when wizards go for the deluxe, premium, DLC version of soul damage? Welcome to Horcruxes, which are somehow way worse than the books actually let on. In case you've forgotten, the in-universe explanation sounds almost neat. You commit murder, that rips your soul, you shove the fragment into an object with a spell, and boom, immortality insurance. It's presented like a really unethical USB backup. The problem is, that's the PG-13 summary. The series kind of cuts away from the camera right when it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean metaphysically obscene. Rowling has said outside the books that making a Horcrux is meant to be supreme evil. Not just killing someone, but a deliberate, ritualized mutilation of your own soul. We're going to talk dark spells, focused intent, probably extra suffering layered on top of the murder itself. If you're like me, you read that and immediately think, okay, what exactly was teenage Tom Riddle doing in that cave with the kids he lured from the orphanage? Because that is not just a field trip. And the soul bit you stash away? It's not a nice, clean backup copy. It's a trapped, semi-conscious shard of you, still aware enough to hate, manipulate, and act. The diary isn't just a recording. It literally possesses Ginny, writes back, gaslights her, and slowly eats her life. The locket whispers, lies, and weaponizes every insecurity in the room. That's not Data. That's a prisoner. What's worse, each Horcrux seems to exaggerate a different emotional glitch in Voldemort's psyche. The diary is all about manipulation and grooming. The ring tempts and corrupts, dangling power and family legacy at Dumbledore. The locket radiates despair, paranoia, self-loathing. It's like every time he rips his soul, one specific neurosis gets its own cursed studio apartment and starts broadcasting. Which means the Voldemort we see walking around is not just evil, he's incomplete. He's missing chunks of himself that are out there suffering in objects, stewing in their own specific flavors of misery. You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling explicitly ties his inability to feel love or remorse to the damage he's done to his soul. It's not that he's born incapable. He's progressively amputated the parts that could have pulled him back. Fans have run with this and suggested each Horcrux likely needed its own tailored ritual, keyed to the meaning of the object. Heirlooms, relics, trophies of murder. Everyone is a little narrative about what Tom cared about. Bloodlines, Hogwarts founders, his own achievements. You're not just killing, you're curating your atrocities. And his body? That's probably collateral damage. The slide from handsome prefect to snake-faced corpse thing reads less like evil makes you ugly and more like a magical feedback loop, where the shredded soul can't properly anchor to human flesh anymore. By Deathly Hallows, he's practically a walking Horcrux himself. The worst part is what happens after. When each Horcrux is destroyed, do those screaming fragments rejoin? Do they evaporate? Do they just linger as magical pollution, like psychic nuclear waste around Hogwarts and the forest? Because if Horcruxes are the respectable dark magic wizards are willing to name and footnote, what does it look like when they go even deeper into soul crimes so bad the wizarding world doesn't admit they exist? So if Horcruxes are the stuff you can literally read about in a school library, even a restricted one, you might be asking yourself, what didn't make it onto the shelves? If the How to Staple Your Soul to a Teacup chapter survived, that implies there used to be a whole syllabus of soul crimes that got banned, shredded, or just never written down because even dark wizards went, yeah, maybe no paper trail on this one. And once you start thinking that way, you get to something I like to call soul shrapnel. Not the neat, intentional slice of a Horcrux, but the messy, accidental fragments that blow off when magic or trauma hits too hard. Voldemort turning Harry into an unplanned soul hitchhiker is the textbook example. He's trying to do the standard curse and flex, his body explodes, and a chunk of his soul just panics and grabs the nearest baby. If that can happen once, how many times has it almost happened, or half happened, in wizarding history? If you're like me, you start wondering about the lighter versions that sit between normal person and full Horcrux. What about deliberate, partial soul transfers? Not immortality, but binding a sliver of yourself to someone else so you can control them, supercharge them, or just make sure they never quite get you out of their head. House elf magic already feels like a warped cousin of this. Their identity is magically welded to a bloodline and a house. Blood oaths like the unbreakable vow walk the same line. You're not just promising, you're staking some essential part of yourself on another person's choices. Push that back a few centuries, and you get the really nasty fan theories. Ancient families doing generational soul binding. Grandpa Black doesn't just leave you his vault. He leaves you a literal imprint of himself, piggybacking on your soul, keeping the family magic concentrated and the family opinions even harder to escape. At that point, you're basically an inherited, low-res Horcrux vessel walking around without consent. And I mean, come on, tell me that wouldn't explain half the pure-blood obsession with tainted lines. Now scale it out. If one murder can tear a soul, what does a battlefield do? You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling has said Dementors multiply in war and despair, which sounds suspiciously like mass-produced soul fallout. Imagine rituals designed to harvest that energy on purpose. Mass sacrifice circles that power fortresses, wards, or curses. Places like Normangard and Azkaban feel spiritually radioactive for a reason. Azkaban literally predates the Ministry, built by a dark wizard whose experiments attracted Dementors. That's not a prison. That's a soul reactor someone else moved into. Once you see that pattern, certain locations in the series start looking less creepy set piece and more crime scene. The cave where Voldemort hid the locket, with the blood door and the Inferi Lake. The Gaunt shack, soaked in generations of obsession and Parseltongue curses. The death chamber in the Department of Mysteries, where a literal veiled arch whispers. These feel like places where soul magic has been done repeatedly, to the point it leaves a scar you can walk into. And who studies that? The unspeakables, obviously. The Ministry's official stance is, soul tampering is unspeakably evil, and then they name an entire job unspeakable and give them a death room. That's not a moral line. That's a, we do it in the basement only policy. You cannot convince me they aren't poking at exactly this kind of thing. controlled fragmenting, containment, maybe even trying to scrub or weaponize soul shrapnel. Which raises the really fun question to think about before bed. If an accidental soul fragment can latch onto a baby and grow up as a scar and a language pack, and Horcruxes can think and feel and manipulate, how many hauntings or cursed individuals are actually just people with someone else's soul debris stuck to them? How many objects in Borgin and Burke's have a personality because part of someone never let go? At that point, is the wizarding world walking around in one big second-hand soul cloud, bumping into echoes they don't even recognize as people anymore? And now that we've broken the soul into confetti, we're going to look at what happens when magic itself turns on its user. When the damage doesn't splinter your soul outward, it implodes inward and starts eating you alive. Which is where Obscurials come crashing in. Obscurials are what happens when magic gets PTSD. In case you've forgotten Fantastic Beasts because, your brain tried to protect you, an Obscurial is a young witch or wizard who violently suppresses their magic. Not just, I don't want to do homework, suppresses it, but, if anyone finds out what I am, I die, suppresses it. That bottled-up power warps into an Obscurus, a destructive, semi-sentient parasite made of their own magic that erupts as a shadowy mass and wrecks everything in reach. That flips the usual Harry Potter logic on its head. Magic is supposed to be this quirky gift, right? You get a letter, you buy a wand, you traumatize a toad in Transfiguration. But with Obscurials, magic is not a neutral tool. It's an internal threat. If you can't safely be who you are, your own power literally turns inward and starts tearing you apart. The thing that should have saved you becomes the thing that kills you. Credence Barebone is the franchise finally saying the quiet part out loud. He grows up in the Second Salem Church under an adoptive mother who beats children for the slightest hint of magic. He's forced to deny his identity so completely that his magic only exists as this repressed storm. When it breaks loose, it levels streets, tears up subway tunnels, shreds buildings. And then you hear the chilling detail. Most Obscurials die before age 10. Credence isn't just powerful. He's a statistical outlier in a graveyard we never see. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, wait, have we seen this before? Aberforth's description of Ariana Dumbledore suddenly looks a lot less random. She has uncontrollable outbursts, destroys a room, injures people without a wand, and everyone around her is terrified and confused. Fantastic Beasts quietly confirms what the fandom already suspected. Ariana was almost certainly an early, undocumented Obscurial, living in a time before anyone had the language for what was happening to her. And that's the really nasty part. Obscurials aren't a random curse that occasionally drops out of the sky. They're a systemic failure. They only form in cultures that refuse to protect magical children, whether it's Muggle witch hunts, internal blood prejudice, or institutions like Second Salem whipping up anti-magic hysteria for donations. You don't get an Obscurus without a community choosing to look away. So how many Obscurials has the wizarding world quietly lost? Think about medieval burnings, the Goblin rebellions, Grindelwald's war, Voldemort's first rise. You don't have to take my word for it. Dementors canonically multiply in chaos and despair, so why wouldn't Obscurials spike during the same periods? I mean, come on. Do we really think the Ministry doesn't have a dusty protocol file labeled Urban Gas Explosion? Actually, child made of rage smoke. Then Grindelwald makes it worse. We learn an Obscurus can be separated from its host and contained, and he tries to weaponize Credence, treating a traumatized kid like raw material for a living nuke. If that's possible, how many dark wizards have experimented with detachable Obscuruses as reusable weapons? How many natural disasters are just failed attempts to bottle that power? And if Hogwarts is the safe option, What happens to magical kids who never get their letter, or who live in places without schools, without secrecy laws that actually protect them? How many potential Obscurials are out there right now, misdiagnosed, unrecorded, disappearing into cover stories and rubble? Because if Obscurials are what happens when magic is suppressed by fear, the next step down the iceberg is what happens when magic is weaponized on purpose, starting with the Dumbledore family's darkest secrets. So if Obscurials are what happens when magic gets crushed by fear, the Dumbledores are what happens when that fear meets power and politics. And it starts with a girl who, in case you've forgotten, is mostly a sad backstory footnote in the main series. Ariana Dumbledore is attacked by a group of Muggle boys when she's 6. They see her doing magic. They try to teach her a lesson, and something in her just snaps. After that, she can't control her powers. She has violent outbursts. She destroys things. She hurts people. And her mother Kendra hides her away like a family shame. Years later, you get the infamous three-way duel. Albus, Aberforth, Grindelwald, spells flying. Someone's curse hits Ariana, and she dies. The books frame it as a tragic accident and a moral lesson about youthful arrogance. Roll credits. But once Fantastic Beasts comes along, suddenly Ariana isn't just a traumatized kid. She's almost certainly an Obscurial. That thing Newt keeps in a case, the dark parasitic cloud born from a child forced to suppress magic. Yeah, that. Retroactively, Ariana becomes one of the earliest known victims of a condition the wizarding world still barely understands and definitely does not want to talk about. You might be asking yourself, is that really supported? Or is this just Warner Brothers lore spackle? Look at the details. Aberforth describes her magic turning inward and erupting. Albus talks about fits and rages. The family moves. Kendra keeps her isolated. Neighbors barely see her. That's exactly how Obscurials are treated later. Hidden, controlled, never actually helped. If you're like me, you read those conflicting Albus and Aberforth accounts now and hear all the stuff they're not saying. Injuries that got memory charmed away. Maybe accidental deaths. Years of everyone walking on eggshells because their house is literally a bomb. Then the pattern repeats with Credence Barebone, just with more fascist aesthetics. He grows up in the Second Salem Church, getting beaten for any hint of magic, gaslit into hating himself, and what happens? He becomes an Obscurial so powerful that Grindelwald basically slaps a weapon of mass destruction label on him and walks him through Paris. The wizarding world had Ariana as a warning sign and pretty much learned nothing. And sitting right in the middle of all this is the Dumbledore family shaping policy by accident. Percival attacks the Muggle boys who hurt Ariana and gets sent to Azkaban for life. Kendra hides Ariana instead of seeking help. Young Albus, watching all this, becomes obsessed with secrecy, with controlling information, with that, for the greater good mindset, he and Grindelwald workshop together. I mean, come on, you don't have to take my word for it. The guy literally spends the rest of his career playing chess with children. What's wild is that adult Dumbledore, global moral compass, and supreme mugwump never publicly uses his platform to talk about Obscurials or magical child abuse. No campaigns, no Hogwarts curriculum, no, hey, maybe don't beat your magical kids or they'll explode. That silence feels less like trauma shyness and more like a calculated cover-up. Which is where fan theories kick in that the Ministry and Dumbledore quietly classified Obscurial research. Either they're terrified someone will weaponize it, or they don't want parents realizing how many kids are at risk. Dumbledore's whole life becomes managing the fallout of one catastrophic trauma he never really fixes, just redirects. He'll let similar tragedies repeat if they serve his long game against Grindelwald and later Voldemort. And we're going to come back to Dumbledore's moral gymnastics later as we get into soul magic and war crimes. But for now, we need to zoom out from one damaged family to the larger pattern. What does a world built on weaponized magic do with all the collateral damage it creates? What does a world built on weaponized magic do with all the collateral damage it creates? If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking the answer was basically, Voldemort shows up and everyone panics. But Voldemort is not the wizarding world's first big bad. He's just the one who got the cool snake logo and the YA marketing. The books keep name-dropping earlier dark wizards, goblin rebellions, and giant wars like they're fun trivia instead of centuries of organized violence. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how bad could it really have been if it's crammed into history of magic essays? Pretty bad. Before Hogwarts is even a thing, you've got unregulated wizards, magical creatures, and muggles all fighting in the open. No statute of secrecy, no obliviators, just raw spellfire in the middle of medieval villages. Wizards are dueling in streets, dragons are torching farmland, muggles are burning witches, and half of those witches are probably just squibs who annoyed the wrong neighbor. It's chaos, and the International Statute of Secrecy reads way less like, let's coexist, and way more like, we broke the world, time for damage control. Then you hit the Goblin Rebellions. In case you've forgotten, Binns mentions them like 6 times and never explains anything, which is exactly what you do when your country's history is mostly war crimes. We're told goblins keep rebelling over wand rights and control of treasure. Translation: wizards promise them power, betray them, then crush the uprisings. These aren't just rowdy goblins throwing chairs in Gringotts. We're talking massacres, confiscated vaults, and brutal reprisals that hard-bake goblin resentment into the setting. By the time we meet Griphook, his distrust isn't a personal quirk. It's generational trauma with interest. Giants get it even worse. The giant wars are framed as necessary self-defense, but read between the lines and it sounds like a slow-motion genocide. The Ministry and its predecessors systematically hunt them, drive them into remote, freezing mountains, cut off resources, then act shocked when the survivors side with Voldemort. I mean, come on, if your entire species has been pushed to the edge of extinction by wand-wielding colonizers, you're not exactly signing up for the Auror internship program. And that's just the species-level stuff. Individual dark wizards have been doing Voldemort-style horror for centuries. Herpo the Foul invents the Horcrux, starts breeding basilisks by shoving chicken eggs under toads, and basically speedruns every forbidden experiment trope in one lifetime. Soul magic, monstrous bioweapons. That's not Voldemort innovating. That's Voldemort reading the worst possible history textbook and going, bet. All of this violence hardens into institutions. The Auror office isn't some neutral law enforcement squad. It's the professionalization of witch hunters and war mages. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures grows out of centuries of trying to categorize anything non-human as either a tool, a pet, or a threat. Dementors get turned from wild manifestations of despair into outsourced prison guards, because why not build your justice system on psychic torture if you've already normalized everything else? And Hogwarts. Hogwarts politely pretends most of this never happened. You memorize dates, you write essays on Goblin Rebellion of 1612 like it's a math problem, and nobody sits you down to say, hey, our side probably did massacres. By the time Voldemort shows up, the wizarding world has lived in this stew of prejudice and normalized violence for so long that his ideology feels less like a shocking new evil and more like an extreme version of attitudes people already quietly hold. And one of the worst legacies of those early wars isn't even a person. It's a place. Azkaban. and the creatures that feed it. Dementors are one of those things where, if you're like me, you kind of accept them as spooky prison guards on your first read, and then you grow up and go, wait. The government hired carnivorous depression ghosts to run their Alcatraz. In case you've forgotten, these things aren't just scary vibes in cloaks. They are literal soul predators. They feed on happiness. They force you to relive your worst memories, and their party trick is the Dementor's kiss, where they suck your soul out through your mouth. That's not me being dramatic. The books straight up say it's a fate worse than death. Your body keeps breathing, but the person is gone. That's the official justice system. So where do you even get one Dementor, let alone a whole security staff? Rowling said they congregate in places of suffering and decay. They're like spiritual rats in a garbage dump, except the garbage is human misery. Azkaban's original fortress was one of those places, long before the Ministry slapped their logo on it. You might be asking yourself, did someone build a castle and then Dementors moved in? Or did the castle basically grow Dementors the way a rotten log grows mushrooms? We get this hint that Azkaban started as a dark wizard's hideout, a guy doing charming hobbies like soul experiments and prolonged torture. If you picture centuries of prisoners, rituals, maybe some early soul magic that makes Horcruxes look like amateur hour, you end up with a building marinated in terror. In that kind of place, Dementors don't just show up, they multiply. They breed in despair and chaos. Magical war? Political purges? That's a baby boom for them. Now here's the really wild part. When the Ministry finally discovers this nightmare island, their response is not, we should cleanse this evil and shut it down. They go, oh, free prison guards. They literally strike a deal. You get a steady buffet of human suffering. We get cheap security. No salaries, no unions, just endless trauma. And remember, a ton of people in Azkaban never even got a real trial, especially during the wars. So you've got a justice system that doesn't just lock you up. It hands you over to creatures that slowly erode your sanity, identity, and will to live. On paper, it's a sentence. In practice, it's a psychological execution, stretched out over years. It gets worse when they leave the island. The Ministry sends Dementors to Hogwarts in Prisoner of Azkaban for protection. They deploy them in wartime. And the second Voldemort offers them more souls and less oversight, they flip. Loyalty isn't a concept. Hunger is. People talk about Dementors as a metaphor for depression and trauma, and that absolutely tracks. But if they can literally kiss a soul out of a body, where does that soul go? Is it destroyed? Trapped? Digested? And what does it say about this society that the Ministry signs off on that as a legal punishment? Rowling has said Dementors multiply during wars and disasters, which means every time wizards create mass despair, they're basically farming more of these things. They're not just monsters. They're spiritual pollution made flesh. So if Dementors are the infestation, what kind of place is Azkaban itself that it could breed them in the first place? We're going to dig into that next, and it's somehow even worse than the guards. So if Dementors are the infestation, Azkaban is the petri dish. In case you've forgotten, this place is not just a jail with a bad Yelp score. It's a crumbling stone fortress in the middle of a freezing, storm-hammered sea, wrapped in fog, with no visible way off and no real sense of time, where the guards literally eat your happiest memories while you sit alone in a cell and slowly forget why you exist. The books keep it almost background noise, but if you're like me, you read those scenes and go, this isn't a correctional facility. This is a slow-motion execution chamber. No rehabilitation programs, no visitors for most inmates, no books, no light, just the sound of waves and people screaming a few corridors over. It feels less like a prison designed by a government and more like something that was already evil, and the Ministry just slapped a logo on it. Which is kind of what happened. Rowling said Azkaban predates the Ministry by centuries. It started as the stronghold of a reclusive dark wizard who did experiments so horrific that even after he died, the place was magically toxic. Dementors were attracted to it long before anyone thought, hey, free security system. You might be asking yourself, what do you even have to do to stain an island that badly? We're talking the magical equivalent of nuclear testing. Mass human sacrifices where the deaths are part of a spell structure. Systematic soul extraction. Horcrux-adjacent rituals that rip pieces off people without even rewarding anyone with immortality. Blood magic wards keyed to suffering, where the building gets stronger every time someone begs for mercy. Maybe attempts to punch through the veil between life and death so hard that reality frays around the impact site. That kind of stuff doesn't just fade, it leaves residue. And when the early Ministry finally stumbles on this cursed rock, do they say, wow, we should dismantle this and maybe apologize to the ocean? No, they take the most cost-effective, morally bankrupt option imaginable. Repurpose it. They don't cleanse it. They don't destroy it. They just move in, sign a contract with the Dementors, and inherit the whole dark legacy like a government buying a haunted mall because the rent is cheap. Look at the design choices. No comfort, no color, no stimulation. Cells that are basically stone coffins with bars. Everything is optimized to amplify fear, hopelessness, and isolation, which is exactly the emotional frequency Dementors feed on. It's not just that Dementors guard Azkaban. Azkaban is built to farm food for them. That setup doesn't just punish criminals, it shapes the whole society. The constant threat of being sent there hangs over every trial, every law. It keeps dissent quiet, especially for people already on the edge. Werewolves, giants, political enemies during the war. You don't need truth or reconciliation when you can just point at the sea and say, do you want to end up there? Some fans take it further and argue the stones themselves are inscribed with runes or binding curses that chain the Dementors to the island. Any attempt to dismantle it might crack those spells and release a starving swarm into the wider world. Convenient, right? Now the Ministry can say, we'd love prison reform, but oops, magical nuke. At that point, Azkaban stops being a place and starts being a state-maintained dark artifact. It continuously generates trauma, feeds its own monsters, and leaks magical pollution into the surrounding sea and sky. And if the wizarding world is willing to normalize something that cursed on a national scale, what other structures and objects have they quietly decided are just too useful to get rid of? We're going to dive into those next, when we talk cursed artifacts and the blood magic baked into everyday life. So if Azkaban is a national-scale curse factory, cursed objects are the home edition. Smaller, prettier, and way easier to accidentally put on your finger at a family reunion. We've got to start with the Horcrux-adjacent stuff, because if you're like me, you saw Marvolo Gaunt's ring and thought, cool, resurrection stone. Tragic backstory. Moving on. But that ring is doing 3 jobs at once. It's a symbol of a bloodline, it's housing a soul fragment, and it's booby-trapped with a curse so vicious it starts killing Dumbledore the second he touches it. Same with Slytherin's locket. On paper, it's just a necklace. In practice, it's a portable depression generator that whispers your worst thoughts back at you and slowly isolates you from your friends. That's not just, ow my hand. That's long-term psychological warfare. You might be asking yourself, aren't some cursed objects just like straightforwardly bad? Enter the opal necklace from Borgin and Burke's. In case you've forgotten, it's the one that's claimed the lives of 19 Muggle owners to date. That's a passive curse. You don't have to activate it, you don't have to say Latin, you just touch it and nearly die. It feels like an assassination tool that somehow ended up as a collectible. And the wild part is, it's still on the shelf. The Wizarding World looked at a murder necklace and went, yeah, we can put a price tag on that. Then you've got the Hand of Glory, which is already a fun phrase until you remember it's literally a severed hand from a hanged man. It gives its owner light that only they can see, which is a useful mechanic for burglary, but symbolically it's doing grave robbing, body part magic, and corpses are just gear all at once. I mean, come on, that's an entire ethics class in one prop sitting in Draco's bedroom. And these aren't random trinkets. The Gaunt ring, Slytherin's locket, the Black family's cursed heirlooms. They all tie dark magic to status and bloodlines. Old families don't just hoard gold. They hoard portable, weaponized trauma. You don't have to take my word for it. The cursed opal necklace and vanishing cabinets and biting cupboards are literally inventory at Borgin and Burke's, which exists because there's a whole quiet economy for this stuff. Nocturne Alley is basically Etsy for things that maim you without leaving a spell signature. Over time, you start to wonder if some of these objects are just repositories, soaking up every grudge and ugly intention poured into them. A tiara hidden in the Room of Requirement for a century, then turned into a Horcrux, sitting above generations of students sneaking around? How much jealousy and despair is that thing marinating in? At a certain point, does the curse start thinking back? And if that's what we see on page, how many unlucky family heirlooms are quietly cursed, intentionally or accidentally, with no one wanting to admit Grandma's brooch is why everyone dies young? Next, we're going to flip this around and talk about when the curse isn't on the object at all, but on the blood itself. The mechanics of blood magic, and what it means when your body is the heirloom. If the last section was about cursed heirlooms, blood magic is where the heirloom is literally your circulatory system. Your DNA is a spell component. I mean, come on. Broadly, blood magic in Harry Potter is any spell or enchantment that uses blood or lineage as the lock and key. It's personal, sticky, and once it's on you, you don't just shrug it off with a counter curse. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just old magic? Dumbledore keeps vaguely name-dropping? Kind of. But this is the sharp, weaponized version, where your family tree is basically a binding contract. Start with the one that's framed as good. Lily Potter's sacrifice. In case you've forgotten, Voldemort tries to kill baby Harry. Lily steps in, chooses death when she could have moved aside, and the killing curse rebounds. Dumbledore explains this as a protection rooted in her blood. Then he does something very Dumbledore. He extends that protection by anchoring it to Petunia, Lily's sister, so long as Harry can call her house home. On paper, beautiful. In practice, it means Harry is magically required to spend his formative years in a cupboard with people who hate him because the ward is efficient. His ongoing trauma becomes a security feature. If you're like me, you read that as a kid and went, oh, okay, safe house. And only later realized this is an old man deciding that one abused child is an acceptable price for a really strong firewall, and Voldemort learns from it. When he comes back in Goblet of Fire, he takes Harry's blood precisely to piggyback on that protection, twisting the same principle into a kind of anti-ward. Blood magic doesn't care about morality. It cares about rules. Then you've got the unbreakable vow. It's basically a blood oath with special effects. 2 people clasp hands, a third binds them in magic, and if you break the promise, you die. Not metaphorically. Not. You'll regret it. Your own life force enforces the contract. It's the wizarding version of clicking, "I agree to the terms and conditions," and the terms are, mess up and your heart stops. All the obsession with pure blood, half-blood, muggle-born? That's not just racism. It probably started as practical blood magic. Old wards that only recognize certain lineages, vaults that open for a surname, ancestral spells that key off a specific family line. Over centuries, people forget the mechanics and keep the prejudice. Once you accept that, hereditary curses and blessings start looking less random. The Black family's streak of madness, the Gaunt's instability and Parseltongue, even the Weasleys' improbable plot-armored luck could be side effects of generations of tinkering with bloodline protections, pacts, and little curses that never wore off. And this bleeds into politics. Marriage laws, inheritance rules, even house elf bonds may be backed by old blood pacts, making it magically dangerous to break from your role. You're not just disappointing grandma, you're voiding a centuries-old spell. In a world where your blood can bind, protect, or destroy you, privacy and bodily autonomy are optional extras. Next, we're going to look at the creepier cousin of all this, when it's not your blood being tracked, but your name, and even saying Voldemort turns into a kind of bloodless, always-on surveillance spell. So if blood can be turned into a GPS tracker, your name is the Wi-Fi password. During Deathly Hallows, Voldemort slaps a taboo on his own name, and suddenly just saying Voldemort is like turning on Find My iPhone for Death Eaters. In case you've forgotten, this is how the trio get caught. They're in the cafe, they're in the tent, they're trying to be careful, and then someone slips and says the name. Boom. The protective enchantments shred, snatchers apparate in, and it's not random bad luck. It's the spell doing exactly what it was built to do. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how does one word summon a fascist hit squad? And the answer is, magical keyword alert. The taboo is basically a live, always-on notification system keyed to a specific sound pattern. Voldemort or his inner circle bind a trigger to the phonetics of Voldemort, then link that to a tracking web spread over Britain. Anytime the word is spoken inside the net, it pings the caster and drops the wards around the speaker. It's like a dark wizard Google alert, except instead of an email, you get a group of guys in skull masks apparating into your living room. And here's where it gets kind of evil genius. For years, Dumbledore has been training people to say the name out loud to break the culture of fear. He literally tells Harry that fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself. Voldemort looks at that and goes, "Cool, I'll weaponize your therapy exercise." Suddenly, the bravest thing you can do, using the name, becomes the easiest way to get your resistance cells doxed. That flips into soft censorship overnight. People crawl back to you-know-who and he who must not be named, not because they're superstitious, but because the word itself is booby-trapped. If you're like me, you start realizing how much that fractures communication. You can't safely write about him, say his name in strategy meetings, or even vent in your kitchen without wondering who's listening. Mechanically, the taboo almost has to ride on pre-existing infrastructure. We already know the trace can detect underage magic without knowing the exact caster, and the Ministry can monitor flu network calls and probably owl routes. Voldemort's spell feels like it's piggybacking on that ambient surveillance web, retuned from detect magic to detect this specific sound plus intent. I mean, come on. The Ministry had the skeleton of magical mass surveillance lying around. he just filled it with dark meat. And once you see that, the ethics spiral gets ugly. If one dark wizard can do this with a single word, what could a legitimate government do with access to every wand signature, every flu conversation, every owl delivery path? You don't have to take my word for it to see the parallel to real-world keyword monitoring, flagged posts, and the way most people start self-censoring long before anyone actually knocks on their door. The taboo is your reminder that in this world, language and identity are weapons waiting to be claimed. And after Voldemort falls, we're going to see how the Ministry doesn't exactly smash those weapons. It quietly picks them up and starts rewriting the story instead. So we talked about the taboo as a weapon. Now picture what's left when that weapon finally drops. The Great Hall full of bodies, stones still smoking, kids stepping over their dead classmates to find their siblings. The castle's cracked open, the Ministry's a joke, and everyone is just praying the killing is over. In that moment, people don't want justice. They want someone in nice robes to say, "It's fine, go home." Enter Kingsley Shacklebolt, the world's chillest Auror suddenly promoted to magical dad-in-chief. The books frame his interim ministry as this clean break, right? Corrupt fudge, fascist scrimgeour, puppet pious, and now Kingsley, who is competent and deep-voiced and friends with Harry, so problem-solved. But if you're like me, you might be asking yourself how much can actually change when the same pure-blood families own the land, the same senior clerks run the paperwork, and the same Wizengamot fossils still control the laws. We get those quick little mentions of Death Eater trials, and it sounds very Nuremberg at wand point. Except, everybody and their Kneazle suddenly remembers the Imperious curse. Oh, I was marked, but I didn't mean it. I was at the Muggleborn Registration Commission, but like, just stapling forms. And without pensive records for everything, how do you prove who enjoyed the torture and who was just trying not to die? You don't. Especially if their uncle golfs with a senior ministry official. What's really wild is what we don't see. No truth and reconciliation hearings, no public inquiry into why the government thought hiring literal soul-sucking wraiths as prison guards was a vibe. Nobody stands up and says, "Hey, maybe Azkaban being a Dementor farm is bad, actually." Werewolves who were hunted into Fenrir's arms? Giants who got bombed into extinction? No reparations, no outreach, just, wow, that was messy, and back to Quidditch scores. And the narrative very conveniently pivots to something easier. Hero worship. Harry, Dumbledore, McGonagall, the Weasleys, statues, chocolate frog cards, the whole boy who lived twice branding exercise. You don't have to take my word for it. Even in Cursed Child, the big political move is renaming the Time Turner, not dismantling the system that let Umbridge frog march kids onto blood quills. Meanwhile, the really ugly stuff just stays. Blood prejudice doesn't evaporate because Voldemort explodes in sparkles. House elves are still unpaid. Goblins are still treated like ATM goblins. Centaurs are still in the forest pretending they're fine. Hogwarts never adds a trauma counselor. It barely adds basic Muggle studies that isn't just plugs are weird. In case you've forgotten, this is a school where 11-year-olds watch a teacher die and then sit exams. You might be asking yourself where the Daily Prophet is in all this. Oh, they're busy. They're doing glossy spreads on Harry's top 10 bravest moments, redemption arcs for ex-Death Eaters who cry on cue, and dramatic dueling reenactments. What they're not doing is a 6-part investigative series on the Muggleborn Registration Commission, or who signed off on using Dementors as crowd control in the first place. War crimes don't sell as well as nostalgia. So the wizarding world doesn't really heal. It slaps a heroic filter over a festering wound and calls it closure. And the really fun part? Next, we're going to talk about how much of that story was quietly staged by everyone's favorite twinkly-eyed chess master, Albus Dumbledore. So remember how I said the heroic filter was slapped on by the system? Yeah, about that. The system had a project manager, and his name was Albus. I swear it's all for your own good. Dumbledore. Publicly, he's the safest man in the series. Wise, kind, lemon-drop grandpa who fights Voldemort, loves Muggleborns, and occasionally trolls the Ministry by hiring werewolves. If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking, okay, this is the one adult who actually has it together. But then you hit Deathly Hallows and the King's Cross chapter, and suddenly he's like, oh yeah, I was kind of a teenage fascist. I got people killed. And I've been playing 5-dimensional chess with your life since you were in nappies. Let's start with the big one. Harry as the pig for slaughter. Dumbledore's words, not mine. He leaves baby Harry with abusive relatives on purpose, using blood magic he barely explains and never seriously checks on the fallout. He withholds the full prophecy, dribbles out information on Horcruxes, and very carefully shapes Harry's worldview so that, when the time comes, he'll walk into the forest and let Voldemort kill him. Not too early, not too late, just right for narrative maximum impact. You might be asking yourself, is that love, or is that grooming someone to die on your schedule? Then there's Snape. Dumbledore finds a miserable ex-Death Eater drowning in guilt over Lily, and instead of getting him therapy, he turns that guilt into a renewable energy source. Swear you'll protect the boy. Swear you'll spy on Voldemort. Swear you'll kill me when I tell you. He binds Snape with promises, secrecy, and just enough affection that Snape keeps going, even when the plan ends with him as another sacrificial lamb in the Shrieking Shack. And while all this is happening, Dumbledore's literally running a child soldier training program. He nudges Harry toward forming Dumbledore's army, smiles approvingly at teenagers practicing combat magic in a school, and fully knows war is coming. In case you've forgotten, these are kids who will be maimed, tortured, or dead within 2 years. But hey, at least they learned a non-verbal Expelliarmus. The common thread is information control. Dumbledore knows about Horcruxes long before he tells anyone. He understands blood wards, the taboo on Voldemort's name, and he has this deep lore on Grindelwald, Obscurials, and Ariana that he shares with, like, 2 people and a half-written obituary. You don't have to take my word for it. He literally admits he avoided power because he didn't trust himself, but he still hoards knowledge and steers everyone else with it. Morally, it's a mess. He genuinely hates fascism, protects Muggleborns, and fights for the vulnerable. But he also repeatedly decides that other people's suffering is an acceptable line item in the budget of the greater good. That phrase is not an accident. It's the slogan of his Grindelwald era, and he never fully drops it. He just rebrands it as kindness with better PR. So does the wizarding world ever escape Dumbledore's influence, or does his curated version of the war become the official history? Next, we're going to zoom out from one chess master to the whole board. How Hogwarts, the Ministry, and the post-war textbooks quietly decide what the next generation is allowed to remember, and what gets buried with the bodies. If Dumbledore is the guy quietly editing the script, the Ministry is the studio doing massive reshoots and pretending that's how the movie always looked. And in a world where you can literally erase someone's memories with a flick, that's not just a metaphor, that's policy. We start small, personal scale. Gilderoy Lockhart is the cartoon version of this. A man who builds an entire career by nuking other people's memories and stealing their stories. It's played for laughs, but if you're like me, You hit Order of the Phoenix and suddenly remember, oh, right, this is the same universe where the Ministry has an entire office of obliviators whose job is to rewrite Muggle eyewitnesses. Dragonflies over a campground. Family saw the dark mark? Don't worry, we'll just go in your head and rearrange the furniture. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how often does that happen? The books casually tell you, all the time. It's routine. It's paperwork. Which makes it way less of a stretch when the Ministry scales that instinct up and starts doing memory work on an entire society without ever casting a spell on them. Look at the Voldemort return arc. Fudge doesn't just deny it, he weaponizes denial. Harry and Dumbledore get branded unstable, attention-seeking, dangerous. The Daily Prophet turns into a state media outlet overnight, pumping out hit pieces, selectively quoting, making sure the average witch on the street can say, "Oh, I read they're lying," instead of, "Wait, are we in mortal danger again?" No obliviate needed when you can just drown people in a nicer story. Hogwarts, meanwhile, is like the long-term memory project. History of magic is literally taught by a ghost who died before the really ugly stuff. No meaningful coverage of Grindelwald's war, almost nothing on the first rise of Voldemort, and absolutely zero. Hey kids, here's how we all kind of let fascism happen twice. Defense against the dark arts is so cursed it becomes a running joke, which is a great way to not ask why this subject, specifically, is structurally sabotaged, and the gaps are really pointed. Goblin rebellions? Reduced to quirky uprisings, not centuries of financial exploitation. House elf enslavement? Framed as cute loyalty. Giants are dangerous brutes, not the targets of organized persecution. Dementors are prison guards, not sentient predators the Ministry hired and then lost control of. You don't have to take my word for it. Hermione is basically the only character who even tries to say, "Hey, this is messed up," and everyone treats her like she's doing a school project, not whistleblowing. Then you've got the Muggle-worthy excuse committee, whose whole purpose is crafting lies that sound reasonable. Gas leak, freak weather, mass hallucination. The message is clear. Reality is negotiable if it keeps wizards comfortable and muggles ignorant. After the war, what do you think the textbooks look like? My bet. Dark times, brave resistance, a couple sanitized paragraphs on Death Eaters, almost nothing on all the Ministry departments that collaborated, profiteered, or just looked away. The narrative hardens into, "We were tested. We triumphed. Please stop asking where the bodies are." Once you accept that memories can be edited, history exams are just the written version of Obliviate. Change the syllabus. Change the story. And the creepiest part, the darkest lore isn't only in cursed diaries and locked cabinets. It's in what every 11-year-old never learns to question. Next, we're going to the one place even the Ministry can't fully spin, the Department of Mysteries, and all the stuff it's clearly hiding even from itself. The Ministry has propaganda, sure, but the Department of Mysteries is where it stops pretending to be wholesome. In case you've forgotten, this is the one branch of government literally staffed by people called unspeakables, not researchers, not analysts. Just, we do stuff we can't even describe without getting HR involved. We're going to walk back into that circular black corridor in Order of the Phoenix, where every door spins and the floor feels like you're inside a spell diagram. Each room is a thesis statement about reality. Love, time, death, thought, prophecy. If you're like me, the first time you read it, you just thought, wow, cool set piece. On a reread, it feels like a morally dubious basement lab that somehow got a government grant. Take the Hall of Prophecy. Miles of shelves, thousands of dusty glass orbs muttering futures that most of their subjects never hear. You might be asking yourself, who decided which prophecies get bottled? Who listens to them? And what does it mean that the ministry can literally walk down an aisle and check your fate like it's a library book? Free will gets weird when your choices are being archived by a guy with a clipboard and a wand. Then you hit the death chamber, a simple stone amphitheater, a crumbling archway, a tattered veil that whispers to anyone who gets too close. This is not a metaphor. This is a stable gateway to whatever counts as the afterlife in this universe. And they just parked it in the basement like an old filing cabinet. I mean, come on. You don't build stadium seating around a death portal unless people have been watching it do things for a very long time. And that's the pattern. The time room is full of time turners, clocks, and experimental time magic, until the battle shatters everything into looping, endlessly reforming sand. That visual basically screams, we have been casually messing with causality for years, and now the bill is due. How many test runs went wrong? How many people got unborn, quietly, off page? The brain room might be the most on-the-nose horror. Tanks of pearly, thought-tentacled brains that attack Ron when he gets too close. Brains don't just grow on trees. To have a whole room of them, you're implying long-term, ethically awful experimentation on thought itself. You don't have to take my word for it, but a jar of disembodied cognition usually means someone lost a head along the way. And that's just what we see. What about the doors we never open? If they've got public-facing rooms for time and death, you really think they don't have a locked-off wing for soul research, Obscurial studies, Dementor behavior, maybe even Horcrux-like artifacts that fell off the back of a dark wizard? Slap the label mystery on it, and suddenly you never have to write an ethics report. The Department of Mysteries is where wizard curiosity and wizard cruelty overlap on a Venn diagram that's basically a circle. And the terrifying question is, what happens to all the failed experiments, the broken gateways, the cursed leftovers they can't control? Some of that stuff doesn't just get shelved, it gets buried. Sometimes, literally. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, is this just how magic works here? Or did the whole society collectively decide to shove its worst habits under the rug and never speak of them again? Because if you're like me, looking back over this iceberg so far, a pattern starts to pop out that's way uglier than any single cursed locket. We've seen soul magic start out basically normalized and academic, then retroactively treated like an unspeakable aberration once Horcruxes get too real. We've got Obscurials, which are literally weaponized childhood trauma, quietly filed under mysterious accidents instead of maybe don't abuse magical kids. The past wars? Sanitized into heroic bedtime stories while the giant purges, Dementor breeding booms, and Azkaban's origin as a dark wizard's lab get edited down to one sad paragraph in A History of Magic. Dementors get domesticated as prison guards. Cursed objects are traded like vintage vinyl. Blood magic is baked into law and old protections. And the Department of Mysteries? They're standing in the middle of all of it, taking notes. So what's left that nobody talks about at all? First category, magical catastrophes that never made it into the official timeline. Failed dark rituals that ripped holes in reality. Obscurial incidents that leveled villages. Time experiments where someone tried to push a time turner too far and snapped a whole day in half. You know those freak storms, unexplained fires, or weird fogs that muggles blame on climate change or gas leaks? In case you've forgotten, Rowling flat out said Dementors multiply in war and disaster. Imagine how many natural disasters are actually magical fallout, politely mislabeled by the Obliviator Squad. Second category, erased communities and bloodlines. We hear about the big families because they survived the PR department. What about the ones that didn't? Whole lines cursed into infertility, villages hexed into permanent silence because they saw ministry war crimes, squib-heavy families quietly vanishing after tragic accidents. You don't have to take my word for it. We already know giants and werewolves were hunted and driven out. Scale that mentality up, add blood magic, and suddenly the gaps in the family tapestries start to look intentional. Third category, living secrets. People walking around with altered memories so deep they've forgotten they were ever changed. Witches and wizards bound by unbreakable vows they can't talk about, not because they're loyal, but because their heart will literally explode. Folks carrying lingering soul fragments from botched Horcrux work, generational blood curses that manifest as bad luck, or experimental enchantments slapped on them in a war hospital. How many eccentric relatives are actually magical test cases no one debriefed? And all of this leaves fingerprints in places we already know. Azkaban isn't just a prison, it's a Dementor farm built on top of some original horror show. The Forbidden Forest is basically a magical landfill of creatures, graves, and failed projects. Nocturne Alley feels like a cursed object flea market because it probably is. The battlefields from both wars are still soaked in enchantments and unmarked dead. If anyone ever did a proper forensic sweep, half the official history curriculum would have to be rewritten. Now zoom out. That's just Britain. Normangard is sitting there with Grindelwald's experiments in The Greater Good. Ilvermorny has a founding story that's way too neat for a continent with Salem, colonization, and centuries of magical conflict. We barely hear about African, Asian, or South American ministries, which is suspicious on its own. You really think only the British wizards outsourced their guilt to memory charms and propaganda? Because that's the real defense mechanism of this world. Not wards, not wand work, but organized forgetting. Take something monstrous, reframe it as folklore, push it far enough back that it feels like a closed chapter instead of an open wound, and suddenly nobody has to ask who's still suffering from it. And we're not done. The layers below this? That's where we stop playing nice with canon. We're going to talk fringe theories, cursed bloodlines, and what happens if magic itself outlives humanity and just keeps going without us. If you thought Horcruxes were the worst-case scenario, I mean, come on, we're only halfway down. And speaking of magic that stops playing nice with canon, we have to talk about one of the creepiest background spells in the whole series, the taboo on Voldemort's name. It sounds like a fun narrative device, right? Say the scary name. Death Eaters appear. Jump scare. Roll credits. But if you're like me, the more you think about it, the more it feels less like a curse and more like the wizarding version of the NSA. In case you've forgotten, in Deathly Hallows, the trio start calling him you-know-who again, not because they're scared of the syllables, but because saying Voldemort literally pings your location. It's a triggered curse bound to a specific word. The moment you speak it, it breaks protective enchantments and broadcasts where you are so, snatchers can apparate in. That's not just some edgy jinx. That's a system-level spell running on the entire country. Someone basically installed magical spyware on the English language. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how does that even work? The books never give us a tech manual, but we can reverse engineer it from what we do see. Functionally, it behaves like a protean charm gone feral. Instead of linking coins in Hermione's bag, it links every instance of one phonetic pattern. Voldemort. Add in a tracking jinx so it locks onto the speaker's position, and a summoning beacon that pings Death Eater's marks or some central focus object, and you've got a distributed sensor network keyed to a sound. The spell isn't on a wand or a wall, it's on the word itself. Which is insane. Magic is now like listening. Constantly. To everyone. Everywhere the taboo is in effect, the spell has to be monitoring spoken language well enough to distinguish Voldemort from random noise, accents, and probably drunk wizards in Nocturne Alley. I mean, come on, that's not just Dark Lord theatrics. That's a proof of concept for global-scale, always-on surveillance. And here's the really fun horror. If you can do this to one name, you can do it to any word. Imagine a ministry version keyed to order or resistance, automatically flagging dissidents, or a paranoid pureblood using it on their own name to track who's gossiping. You don't even need Veritaserum if the language itself is booby-trapped. People start censoring themselves, not because they're polite, but because they're literally afraid a casual complaint will spawn armed wizards in their living room. You don't have to take my word for it that this isn't a one-off wartime hack either. If Voldemort's half-broken regime can improvise this while the ministry is collapsing, what do you think a fully funded, quietly authoritarian ministry could cook up during Grindelwald's era or the First War, when national security was the excuse for everything? We already know they repurposed Azkaban, weaponized Dementors, and normalized unforgivables for Aurors. A linguistic surveillance grid is barely a stretch, and the taboo is just one piece of a pattern. Words, blood, and names keep showing up as the deepest hardwiring in dark magic. So next, we're going to dig into the other half of that equation, blood magic and wards, and what it means when your family tree is literally a spell component. Words, blood, names. We just did the name curse, so now we're going to talk about the part where Harry's entire childhood is basically one long blood ritual that no one explains to him. In case you've forgotten, Dumbledore's official story in Order of the Phoenix goes like this. Lily steps in front of the killing curse willingly. That act of love triggers ancient magic. Voldemort knows not, and Harry walks away with a scar and a built-in protection. Then Dumbledore takes that protection, does some off-screen granddad sorcery, and anchors it to Petunia's bloodline. As long as Harry can call Privet Drive home, the wards stay up. That's the Hallmark Channel version. Read it again through a darker lens, and it stops sounding cute. Lily's not just a loving mom, she's fuel. Her death doesn't end that night. It powers a long-term ward keyed to her blood, Harry's blood, and the address of a Surrey semi-detached. Every summer, when Harry trudges back to Privet Drive, he's not just visiting his awful aunt. He's recharging the spell. He is, functionally, a walking blood ward battery. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't this just love magic? Isn't that the wholesome one? Except in this world, love keeps showing up with a side of knives. Look at other blood-based stuff we actually see. The Goblet of Fire's age line isn't just a funny beard gag. Dumbledore draws a boundary keyed to biological age, which is a sneaky way of saying the magic cares about your body, not your vibes. The Triwizard Contract literally grabs Harry's name, binds it to his person, and will not let him opt out. Then we hit the really on-the-nose examples. In the cave with the locket Horcrux, the door demands blood. It's not like, tell me a password. It's, feed me your arm. The protection is keyed to the physical fact of someone's veins opening on that rock. And in the graveyard, Voldemort's whole resurrection hinges on blood of the enemy, forcibly taken. He doesn't just grab any rando. He specifically steals Harry's blood because that blood is already wrapped in Lily's protection. he hijacks the ward. That is Dumbledore's trick, inverted. If you're like me, you start to wonder how unique Lily's magic really is. Dumbledore talks like this is some once-in-a-millennium event. But I mean, come on. Old pureblood families have been hoarding grimoires and creepy artifacts for centuries. You really think not one Black or Gaunt ever went? What if we anchored the manor's defenses to Cousin Septimus's unfortunate accident? You don't have to take my word for it. We already see non-consensual blood use treated as a tool, not a taboo. So ethically, where does that leave the blood wards? Petunia never signs a form saying, "Yes, please convert my dead sister into a permanent alarm system." Harry is never told, "By the way, your body is now infrastructure." If this is what the good guys are willing to do for protection, what are the bad guys doing quietly? Off-page, with blood, bones, and family trees. And that's the real pattern. Blood isn't just protection, it's currency. It buys safety, it seals contracts, it marks ownership and control. Which is going to matter a lot when we get into the next layer of magical contracts and those supposedly unbreakable bonds that sound way more like supernatural fine print than friendly promises. So, if blood is currency, contracts are the receipt. And in the wizarding world, the receipt can literally kill you. In case you've forgotten, an unbreakable vow isn't just, "I pinky promise." You've got three people, the swearer, the receiver, and a third witch or wizard linking their wands. They speak the terms out loud, and with every promise, a band of fire wraps around their joined hands. Looks dramatic, right? But that pretty little bracelet is basically a magical tripwire on your life. Break the terms, even years later, and you just drop dead. No trial, no ministry hearing, no Wizengamot, just instant magical execution. You might be asking yourself, how does the spell know you broke it? That's the creepy part. This isn't enforcing a single action, it's binding your intent and your future choices. The magic has to be monitoring your will, your decisions, your opportunities to betray the promise. It's like installing a kill switch in your soul. The second your behavior crosses whatever invisible line that vow encoded, it doesn't fine you. It doesn't send you a howler. It just terminates the user. If you're like me, you start to realize this is less honor-bound oath and more EULA from hell. You're agreeing that your continued existence is conditional on staying inside a magically defined behavioral box. And you don't have to take my word for it. Snape stakes his life on one with Narcissa, and everyone treats that as completely binding, to the point where Dumbledore structures his entire death plan around it. Once you see that, a bunch of other contract magic suddenly looks way darker. The Goblet of Fire doesn't just choose champions, it binds them. Harry's name pops out, and every adult in the room goes, "Well, rules are rules. Guess the 14-year-old has to face dragons now." The Goblet is basically a magical HR department that auto-signs you to a lethal internship. The Marauder's map makes you verbally insult it to gain access, which sounds like a joke, but it's still a spoken, keyed phrase that grants or denies power based on what you say. Even the trace on underage magic is a kind of state-imposed contract. By being born magical, kids are automatically enrolled in a surveillance agreement they never consented to. And that's just the respectable side. Imagine what Nocturne Alley does with this stuff. Blood-signed contracts that literally key the spell to your lineage, so if you try to run, it hits your kids too. Pure blood marriage deals sealed with unbreakable vows about heirs, obedience, maybe even non-disclosure, turning spouses into legally sanctioned hostages. House elves already live in magically enforced servitude. Add a few binding oaths, and you've basically created a self-policing slave class that dies if it meaningfully rebels. Half-bloods desperate for protection or money could be tricked into opportunity contracts that are actually life-or-death service agreements. And once you accept that wizarding society is fine with soul-binding promises that kill you for non-compliance, what happens when you mix that with magic that literally tears your soul apart? Next, we're going to loop back to Horcruxes and cursed objects, but this time from the angle of ownership, possession, and what it means when the thing holding your soul might also be holding the fine print. So we've talked about souls and fine print. Now we need to talk about the hardware, because in Harry Potter, a cursed object isn't just a bad idea with a price tag. It's basically a semi-sentient parasite that refuses to be thrown out with the rest of your emotional baggage. Take the obvious one, Tom Riddle's diary. In case you've forgotten, that thing doesn't just hex you, it courts you. It writes back. It gaslights you. It literally drags you into its memories and starts overwriting your personality. You might be asking yourself, is that a curse or is that a very needy roommate? And the answer is yes. The diary punishes distance, rewards secrecy, and keeps pulling Ginny back until she's sneaking down to the chamber like it's a toxic situationship. Same pattern with Marvolo's ring. Dumbledore doesn't just get a nasty blister. He gets a curse that races up his arm and will kill him for daring to use it for something as human as seeing his dead family. The ring sits for decades in a shack and still has enough malevolent, no you don't energy to take out the strongest wizard alive. That's not just dark magic. That's programmed spite. Then you've got the opal necklace at Borgin and Burke's, the one that never had a successful owner. Anyone who touches it is basically scheduled for catastrophe. The Hand of Glory only works for the person who owns it, which sounds cool until you realize it's literally a severed hand that creates personalized darkness. I mean, come on. At some point you have to admit the object is choosing whose side it's on. Borgin and Burke's is full of this stuff. Cursed opals that make people obsessed, music boxes that lull you into this weird, dreamy fixation so strong the book has to snap the characters out of it. These aren't just traps. They're influence machines. They compel you to keep listening, keep touching, keep coming back. If you're like me, you start to read that as a kind of will, just one baked into the spell instead of a personality. And that mindset leaks into the fun side of magic. Hogwarts is crawling with low-grade cursed junk everyone treats as a joke. Biting kettles, trick wands that explode, quills that make your hand cramp or write the wrong thing. You don't have to take my word for it. Fred and George basically run a small-scale curse economy out of their dorm. The line between prank and long-term magical harm gets real blurry when the culture trains kids to laugh off objects that literally attack them. Which raises the uncomfortable question. If random shopkeepers in Nocturne Alley can casually stock mind-warping jewelry and sanity-draining music boxes, what's sitting in the ministry's locked rooms? What's buried in old pure-blood manors, bound to bloodlines and oaths so it only activates for family? What's in the deepest Gringotts vaults that even goblins don't want to touch? And some cursed objects don't just cling to people, they cling to places, which is the perfect segue into Azkaban's origins and the fortress that should never have been inhabited. Azkaban isn't just a bad prison, it's a crime scene that never got taped off. If you're like me, you grew up thinking Azkaban was basically that Dementor place the ministry built, right? Industrial-grade sadness, made to order. But Pottermore quietly drops the much nastier version. The island was already evil before the ministry ever showed up. It started as the private playground of a dark wizard named Ekrisdis, who lived alone in this fortress in the middle of the sea, shrouded in concealment magic so strong that Muggle maps literally didn't know it existed. Ecrizdis specialized in one thing: torture. He'd lure passing Muggle sailors onto the island, keep them imprisoned, experiment on them, and then kill them, all while wrapped in spells that hid the screams, the deaths, the magic, everything. You might be asking yourself how bad one guy's hobby can be to stain an entire island, but the answer is pretty bad. We're talking years of ritualized cruelty, fear, and murder, all layered into the stone. When Ecrizdis finally died, the concealment charms started to fray, and the early ministry went to investigate. They expected like a creepy ruin. What they found was a fortress already crawling with Dementors. Nobody had installed them. No one had ordered a shipment of soul-suckers off Nocturne Amazon. They were just there, infesting the place, as if they'd either been born from the accumulated horror or drawn to it like magical vultures. Rowling said Dementors breed in despair and chaos, that they multiply during wars and disasters, so Azkaban is basically their ideal nursery. This is the chilling part. The Dementors didn't corrupt Azkaban. Azkaban corrupted itself, and the Dementors showed up for the buffet. You don't have to take my word for it. Pottermore straight up frames the island as already poisoned long before the ministry arrives. So what does the enlightened wizard government do with this cursed, unplottable death fortress full of soul predators? Shut it down? Cleanse it? Drop it into the ocean and salt the magical earth? No. They look at this eldritch black site and go, wow, free security system. They decide to use Azkaban as a prison precisely because it's remote, unplottable, and effective. Effective at what? Slowly eroding your will to live. And the more people they send there, the stronger the Dementors get. It's like building your national jail on top of a landfill that literally eats sadness and then being shocked when the stench starts leaking into politics. At this point, Azkaban starts to feel like a Horcrux-adjacent object. Not a literal soul jar, but a place so saturated with despair that it functions like one giant psychic battery. It feeds the Dementors, and in return, they keep the emotional pressure cooker on high, stripping sanity and soul from prisoners, guards, even administrators who stay too long. The island doesn't just hold people, it slowly overwrites them. And if Azkaban is the ministry's worst decision out in the open, their choice to partner with Dementors at all gets way darker when we're going to look at how these creatures came into existence in the first place. So, Azkaban is already a nightmare. But once you start asking where Dementors come from, it stops being spooky prison guards and turns into, oh, this is a metaphysical war crime that learned to walk. In case you've forgotten the basics, Dementors feed on happiness. They breed in despair, and they're the only thing in the series that makes Voldemort go, yeah, no thanks. The Dementor's kiss doesn't break your bones or stop your heart. It just calmly removes your soul and leaves the lights on. Body's still breathing, mind's still technically there, but the person is gone. And everybody in the wizarding world is just, okay, knowing that exists? You might be asking yourself, are these things just another magical species, like a really emo thestral? I don't buy it. Rowling said they multiply in war and disaster, that they breed in chaos and misery. That sounds less like a natural creature, and more like a psychic fungus that shows up wherever reality has been emotionally nuked for long enough. Picture a battlefield where thousands died screaming, or a fortress where a dark wizard spent decades experimenting on prisoners. We're told Azkaban used to be exactly that, a private torture castle whose horrors attracted Dementors long before the ministry showed up with paperwork. So the theory here is that Dementors aren't born. They congeal. They're what happens when human suffering gets so concentrated, so unprocessed, that it curdles into a predator. If you're like me, you read, "They breed in despair," and you don't picture eggs and baby cloaks. You picture new Dementors peeling themselves out of the psychic smog of a place that's been cursed by centuries of terror. And that ties straight into soul magic. The kiss is weirdly specific. It doesn't shred the soul like a botched Horcrux ritual, it relocates it. The body keeps going. That suggests the Dementor is not eating the soul like a snack, it's storing it. Walking around as a mobile, invisible vault full of screaming consciousnesses. Where do they go? Inside the Dementor? Some pocket of cold beyond normal perception? We never see a soul spat back out, which is kind of convenient for everyone who doesn't want to think too hard about it. I mean, come on. The wizarding world spends 7 books freaking out about Horcruxes, but they've casually outsourced capital punishment to sentient soul hoarders. And that's the real horror. The Ministry didn't just tolerate Dementors, it hired them. It turned an emergent disaster of human misery into state infrastructure. Guard the prisoners, suck out their happiness, perform the kiss when we say. You don't have to take my word for it that this is messed up. Even Fudge only cuts ties when they stop being politically convenient and start siding with Voldemort. And if Dementors are what happens when suffering becomes a species, they're probably not the only case of the wizarding world turning monsters into tools. Giants, werewolves, and a whole lineup of dangerous beings have their own, even bloodier, history with wizarding governments that we're going to dig into next. Giants and werewolves are where the wizarding world quietly stops pretending it's the good guy. On paper, it all sounds super reasonable. Giants are violent and dangerous. Werewolves are uncontrollable. The Ministry, very nobly, is just protecting the public. That's the line you get in school textbooks, in case you've forgotten, where all the messy parts get sanded down into neat little giant wars and anti-werewolf legislation, like their zoning laws and not, people. Crack open something like A History of Magic, and it's framed as, giants refuse to integrate. They fought among themselves. They posed a constant threat to muggles and wizards alike, so the Ministry had to intervene. You might be asking yourself, okay, but what does intervene actually mean here? Because when Hagrid talks about giants, we suddenly go from unfortunate but necessary measures to, oh, the Aurors just kept showing up and killing them until they were almost gone. Hagrid tells us giants were forced into the mountains, driven into smaller and smaller colonies, and that by the time Voldemort comes around, there are maybe a few dozen left. That's not, oops, they're a bit rare now. That's a population collapse. And he's not describing big epic battles either. He talks about raids, about the Ministry turning up when the giants are already weakened and finishing the job. It's the kind of language you use when you don't want to say genocide, but you also kind of did one. Werewolves get the same treatment, just with more paperwork. Officially, they're dangerous because they literally lose control once a month. So the Ministry passes protective laws. Sounds fine, right? Except Lupin spells out what that actually looks like. Nobody will hire you. Landlords won't rent to you. Parents pull their kids out of school if you're a teacher. If you're like me, you read that as a kid and went, wow, that's rough. And then, as an adult, you go, oh, this is systemic discrimination with extra steps. We get werewolf legislation that makes it basically impossible to live legally. And then everyone acts shocked when a guy like Fenrir Greyback starts building a feral child army. I mean, come on. If you outlaw someone's ability to work, to exist in public spaces, to access Wolfsbane potion, what are they supposed to do? You push entire groups into poverty and criminality, and then you point at the crime and go, "See? Told you they were monsters." It's a self-fulfilling prophecy with fangs. And this is exactly where Voldemort slides in. Death Eaters show up offering giants something the Ministry never did: power, respect, revenge. Same with werewolves. Greyback and his pack are promised a world where they hunt openly and take what they want. You don't have to take my word for it. Lupin directly says that werewolves were more sympathetic to Voldemort because he at least pretended to value them, while the Ministry just wanted them registered and out of sight. So both wars end up staffed by the people Wizarding Society pushed to the edge and then acted surprised when the edge pushed back. And if giants and werewolves are the ones we actually hear about, you kind of have to ask, what other dangerous creatures got wiped out, driven underground, or quietly erased from the syllabus long before Harry ever showed up at Hogwarts? And that brings us to the really uncomfortable question. What if giants and werewolves are just the tip of a much older, much bloodier iceberg that Hogwarts very politely pretends doesn't exist? In case you've forgotten, Harry's literally in school during an active terrorist insurgency, and his history of magic class is Goblin Rebellions. Goblin Rebellions. And, if you're like me, the overwhelming urge to fall asleep face first into your textbook. Binns never touches the first war against Voldemort. He doesn't cover Grindelwald, the wizarding equivalent of magical Hitler. He doesn't even brush up against anything that might make the Ministry look bad. You might be asking yourself, is that just Binns being boring? Or is that the curriculum doing damage control? Because once you start listening for it, the series is full of throwaway references to earlier conflicts that sound way too intense to be fun little side quests. We hear about multiple goblin rebellions, vampire uprisings, troll wars, and cursed battlefields, where nothing grows and magic goes weird. That's not random flavor text. That's the language people use after something like World War I, where you get entire forests of unexploded curses and places no one wants to talk about because Granddad saw things there. And it's not like the magic in those wars would have been cute. We already know Dementors breed in despair and multiply during wars and disasters, which means every big conflict literally spawns more soul-eating monsters. We know Azkaban started as some dark wizard's fortress long before the Ministry moved in, which sounds suspiciously like a magical black site that just got rebranded as a prison. You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling has said that creating a Horcrux needs a supremely evil act beyond murder, and that kind of ritual doesn't just appear one day because Tom Riddle was bored in the library. So picture those early wars, large-scale dark arts that later get shoved into the unforgivable box, experimental creatures that make acromantulas look like house pets, mass curses laid over whole valleys that still haven't burned out. How many forbidden forests are actually failed weapons tests? How many haunted ruins are magical Chernobyls where the spell fallout never stopped mutating? At that point, it starts to feel less like innocent forgetting and more like selective amnesia. If you never teach kids about the vampire purges or the goblin massacres, or the time the Ministry tried to weaponize Dementors and lost control, then you never have to admit to systemic failure. You never have to say, yeah, we kind of built the conditions for the next Dark Lord. You just let Binns drone, let everyone tune out, and when a charismatic fascist shows up with a familiar playbook, the teenagers don't recognize the sequel. And one of the biggest beneficiaries of that historical fog? That would be Dumbledore, whose carefully curated legend has some very awkward gaps in the pre-Grindelwald era. We're going to peel back that halo next and talk about what the greatest wizard of the age did and didn't tell anyone. So let's talk about the uncomfortable thing. Dumbledore doesn't just benefit from the fog of history, he weaponizes it. The legend of the kindly headmaster is real, but it's only half the story, and the other half looks a lot like a chessboard with kids as pieces. Start with Move 1, leaving baby Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep. On paper, it's blood magic protection, right? Petunia's roof, Lily's sacrifice, all that. But if you're like me, you might be asking yourself why the greatest wizard of the age decided the optimal solution was long-term emotional abuse in a cupboard, instead of, I don't know, literally any vetted wizarding family. He knows exactly what the Dursleys are like from Petunia's letter and from watching them. He still locks Harry into a miserable childhood because a traumatized, isolated boy is easier to aim at a Dark Lord than a well-adjusted kid with options. Then we've got the prophecy. Dumbledore hears the original Trelawney line, knows Voldemort only heard part of it, and just never tells Harry the whole thing until year 5, after Sirius is dead and the Order is in full crisis. Before that, it's all, I will tell you when you're older, and for the greater good, which is the exact phrase he used when he and Grindelwald were sketching out wizard domination over Muggles. Same slogan, different PR. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at Snape. Dumbledore takes a Death Eater who got Lily Potter killed and turns him into a permanent double agent. He plays on Snape's guilt and love, then keeps him on the hook for decades, hated by students, hunted by Voldemort, never really free. And when the time comes to control the Elder Wand, Dumbledore calmly plans his own death, has Snape kill him on schedule, and tries to script the wand's allegiance like he's writing stage directions. That's not just mentorship. That's grooming someone to be a weapon and a scapegoat at the same time. Ethically, this is brutal. Harry is raised to walk into the forest and die on cue. Snape is expected to murder his boss and then die protecting a boy who looks like his bully. Even the Order kids are nudged into acceptable losses. Meanwhile, Dumbledore keeps the twinkle in his eye and the lemon drops, maintaining plausible deniability because technically he never forced anyone. He just arranged the board, so saying no wasn't really an option. And the wild part? The wizarding world is so desperate for a benevolent authority figure after Grindelwald that they let him. They hand him Hogwarts, the Wizengamot, the International Confederation of Wizards, war strategy, all of it, because the alternative is admitting they've built their society on trauma and cover-ups. I mean, come on. When one guy runs the school, the courts, and the resistance, you might want to ask a follow-up question or two. But we're going to see that Dumbledore's style of gentle manipulation for the greater good doesn't die with him. The post-war story, the Ministry's clean narrative, even what gets buried about Horcruxes, Dementors, and Azkaban. Those are shaped by people who watched him work and took notes. And who watched him work and took notes better than anyone? The Ministry. The same people who spent an entire year pretending Voldemort was a bit of a rumor suddenly get to be the guardians of historical truth. I mean, come on. In case you've forgotten, Cornelius Fudge's response to Voldemort literally resurrecting himself in a graveyard is, nope. He walks into the hospital wing, sees a traumatized kid, a dead body, a missing Death Eater, and his first instinct is brand management. You might be asking yourself, how do you spin Dark Lord returns via blood ritual into please stay calm and buy war bonds? Easy. You smear the witnesses. Dumbledore gets painted as senile and power-hungry, Harry as delusional and attention-seeking, and the Daily Prophet becomes this magical Fox News tabloid chimera churning out, "Is the boy who lived cracking up?" headlines. And the wild part is, it works. People who watched Voldemort's first war still choose the comforting story over the scary one, because denial plus a familiar logo on the front page is a hell of a drug. If you're like me, you probably remember reading Order of the Phoenix and wanting to shake every adult in the room. But from the Ministry's perspective, that year is a test run. They learn exactly how far you can push propaganda before the illusion breaks. Fast forward to after the Battle of Hogwarts. Voldemort is dead, the bodies are still warm in the Great Hall, and who gets to write the official narrative of the Second Wizarding War? The exact institution that ignored the threat, jailed the wrong people, installed Umbridge at Hogwarts, and quietly collaborated with Death Eaters until it was politically inconvenient. We're going to watch them do the political equivalent of, "We were always at war with Eastasia." How do you make that work? You find scapegoats and martyrs. Barty Crouch Jr. becomes the perfect cartoon villain, fanatical, giggly, conveniently dead. Umbridge is even better. She's disgusting. She's sadistic. She literally carves words into children. So you throw her under every bus you can find and act like she personally invented institutional cruelty. Toss in a few high-profile Death Eaters in Azkaban, hold some show trials, and boom, evil has faces, names, and tasteful black and white photos. What you don't have to talk about are the boring structural horrors. Blood prejudice baked into law. Creature regulations that keep house elves, goblins, and werewolves permanently exploitable. Azkaban as your main prison, even though you know Dementors multiply in despair and war. That's not one bad apple. That's the orchard. And because the Ministry controls records, trials, and the profit, the root causes of Voldemort never really get touched. Trauma, inequality, bigotry, unchecked magical power. All that stuff just gets a fresh coat of post-war reform paint while the foundations stay rotten. You don't have to take my word for it. The same Dementors, the same Wizengamot culture, the same blood magic taboos all quietly roll on. Which raises the uncomfortable question, what else got edited? Some of the darkest secrets aren't in public records at all. They're buried in sealed trials, memory tampering, and the literal rewriting of people's minds. And speaking of editing, we have to talk about the people whose whole job is literally to hit backspace on reality. If you're like me, the first time you heard Obliviator, you probably pictured some cool men in black wizard with sunglasses and a clipboard. Fun, right? Then you realize what they actually do is wander around after magical accidents, wipe Muggle memories, rewrite eyewitness accounts, and quietly sand down any rough edge that might threaten the statute of secrecy. Their workday is, "Oh, you saw your neighbor get eaten by a chimera? No, you didn't. It was a gas leak. Also, your dog's name is now Nigel." The Obliviator Squad is basically magical damage control. Quidditch pitch crashes, rogue dragons, a flying Ford Anglia over London. They show up, point wands, and adjust the narrative until it's socially acceptable. You might be asking yourself, okay, but aren't they just keeping people safe? And yeah, that's the party line. But once you accept that the state can edit your memories whenever secrecy is threatened, where does that stop? Who decides what counts as a threat? A dragon or a protest? You don't have to take my word for it. You can see the same spell used in way more personal, messed up ways. Gilderoy Lockhart builds an entire celebrity career by tracking down real heroes, stealing their stories with memory charms, and leaving them drooling somewhere in Albania. That's not just plagiarism. That's identity theft on a soul-adjacent level. In case you've forgotten, he tries to do the same thing to Harry and Ron, and it only backfires because he uses Ron's busted wand. Then you've got Marietta Edgecombe. She doesn't get obliviated. She gets something worse. Hermione's jinx brands sneak across her face in angry pustules for talking to Umbridge. It's not a memory edit, but it's the same logic. Mess with someone's mind or body so they can't safely tell their version of events. And the adults just let that ride. Crouch Jr.'s case is the really nasty one. His mother and father fake his death, smuggle him out of Azkaban, and then Barty Crouch Sr. keeps him under the Imperious curse and covers the whole thing with memory charms. When the enchantments slip, Crouch Sr. himself gets his memories altered so badly he wanders around babbling. That's your senior ministry official, supposedly upholding the law, using the same tools to hide his family scandal that the Obliviators use to hide dragons. Once memory is that malleable, what does legal testimony even mean? Pensive evidence, eyewitness accounts, trial records. Any of that can be edited if the right person gets to the right wand at the right time. History turns into whatever the winners didn't obliviate. Personal identity isn't much safer. If your childhood can be selectively blurred, how sure are you that the things you regret are even yours? And that's just the stuff we see. Off-page, it's almost guaranteed uglier. Political opponents waking up with memories of taking bribes. Victims of magical crimes quietly obliviated so crime statistics look better. Whole incidents, botched experiments, minor uprisings, a werewolf riot in some backwater village, scrubbed from collective awareness until they're just weird dreams and local ghost stories. I mean, come on. If the Wizarding's world is this casual about rewriting minds, what happens when someone decides to go one step deeper? If memories can be edited, souls can be broken, and we're going to circle right back to the deepest layer of dark magic. What happens when you tamper not just with memory, but with the core of who someone is? And that brings us to the fun question nobody in universe seems nearly panicked enough about. If you can mess with memory, what about the mind itself? Like, live, in real time. Welcome to Legilimency and Occlumency, the Wizarding world's version of psychic hacking that everybody treats like it's just a quirky elective. In case you've forgotten, Legilimency is not, oops, I made eye contact and accidentally saw your childhood trauma. It's a focused, invasive spell. You point your wand, you say Legilimens, and you basically shove your way into someone's thoughts, memories, and emotions. Snape does it to Harry. Voldemort does it to pretty much everyone. And if you're like me, you look at the Ministry, at Horrors, at the Department of Mysteries, and you go, you expect me to believe they're not using this in interrogations? You might be asking yourself, is it really that bad if it's just surface thoughts? The books tell you straight up it's not. Snape doesn't just see what Harry had for breakfast. He rips through memories of the cupboard under the stairs, the Dementors, Lily dying. Voldemort uses it to sense lies, fear, the exact moment someone decides to betray him. This isn't reading a diary. This is breaking into a house, tearing up the floorboards, and checking what's buried in the backyard. And the defense? Occlumency. Theoretically, it's the cool counter skill. Close your mind. Protect your secrets. Become a human firewall. In practice, it's rare, brutally hard, and built on emotional repression. You don't just learn a spell. You train yourself not to react, not to feel, to compartmentalize pain so aggressively that even a psychic intruder can't find it. That sounds an awful lot like trauma response techniques, right? You don't have to take my word for it. Snape's entire life is basically one long occlumency workshop run by unresolved childhood issues. Most people don't have that. Most kids at Hogwarts definitely don't. So what you end up with is a society where a tiny elite of highly trained, usually already powerful witches and wizards can literally read minds, and everyone else is walking around mentally naked, hoping nobody important decides they're interesting. And Dumbledore, our great champion of love and free will? He orders Snape to invade Harry's mind as a teenager, repeatedly, under the label of lessons. Snape is allowed to yank Harry's worst memories to the surface, mock them, use them against him, and it's framed as necessary training. Protection or abuse? Both? The books never really pause to ask, and Harry is told to be grateful while he's being violated. Once you accept that this is normal, social hierarchies get a whole new layer. It's not just blood status, money, or wand skill. It's who can look you in the eyes and decide whether you're lying, whether you're loyal, whether you're worth trusting, based on thoughts you never consented to share. I mean, come on. How do you even have a fair trial in that world? How do you have a private relationship? A rebellion? If the mind can be casually invaded and the soul can be literally split, at some point there has to be a boundary. Right? A line you don't cross. And the wizarding world keeps dancing right on that edge with things like the Dementor's kiss and Horcruxes, which we're going to dive into next. And speaking of that line you don't cross, we need to talk about one of the most casually dropped war crimes in the series, the Dementor's kiss. Death is one thing. Magical, government-approved soul extraction is a whole different category of messed up. In case you've forgotten, the kiss doesn't kill you. Not physically. It removes the soul and leaves the body alive, breathing, technically. Fine. What you get is a permanent, empty shell, like a magically induced vegetative state that never improves, never wakes up, never even dreams. Someone has to either keep feeding that body, washing it, turning it, or just let it slowly waste away. That's not an execution. That's long-term storage of a person who isn't a person anymore. And the wild part is, this is legal. The Ministry literally authorizes Dementors to perform the kiss on certain criminals. It's on the menu of punishments. You might be asking yourself, who looked at this spectral horror vacuuming people's souls and went, yeah, that seems like a proportionate response? Because when Sirius escapes, Fudge doesn't say, we'll capture him, give him a fair trial, check the evidence. He jumps straight to, we've given the Dementors permission to kiss him. No trial, no appeal, just instant fate worse than death coupon. If you're like me, you read that as a kid and moved on, and then as an adult you come back and go, wait, what actually happens to the soul? We know that in this world, souls persist after death. The Hogwarts ghosts, the Priori Incantatem shades, King's Cross, Harry. So where does a kissed soul go? Is it trapped forever inside the Dementor, conscious but unable to act? Is it shredded and scattered? Is it sitting in some internal void, replaying its worst memories on loop while the Dementor snacks on them forever? Rowling never really answers, which somehow makes it worse. At least with the killing curse, we know the deal. Avada Kedavra is instantaneous. No pain described, no lingering. One flash of green, and you're gone. Body dropped. Soul presumably moving on to whatever afterlife bureaucracy handles wizards. Compared to the kiss, the unforgivable starts to look almost merciful. I mean, come on. In what ethical system is the quick, clean death the forbidden spell, but the eternal soul erasure is a respectable legal deterrent? And notice who actually gets threatened with the kiss. Not Voldemort. Not Grindelwald. It's Sirius, Barty Crouch Jr., random Azkaban escapees the Ministry wants to make an example of. The cruelest punishment isn't reserved for Dark Lords. It's saved for political theater, for moments when the government wants to look tough and you don't have to take my word for it. The text spells that attitude out in Fudge's panic. Once you start lining this up with Horcruxes and Obscurials, it gets even darker. The Kiss, Horcruxes, Obscurials. 3 different ways to break the link between body and soul. 1 is state-sanctioned. 1 is the ultimate dark ritual. 1 is what happens when a child's magic eats itself from trauma. And we're going to see that the deepest dark lore sits exactly where all 3 overlap. So at this point, we've basically built a little soul horror sampler platter. Horcruxes, Obscurials, Dementor's Kiss. 3 different ways to do the same basic crime. Break a person into something less than a person. In case you've forgotten, Horcruxes are the deliberate version. You murder someone. You perform a separate, supremely evil ritual. Rowling refuses to spell out, and you glue a ripped shard of your soul to an object. It's premeditated metaphysical surgery with a steak knife. Obscurials are the opposite vibe. No ritual, no Dark Lord, just a terrified kid repressing magic so hard that their power turns into a parasitic cloud that starts eating them from the inside. Then the Kiss is the outsourced option, where the state literally calls in a floating leech to vacuum your soul out and file the paperwork. You might be asking yourself, how do these all exist in the same setting without anyone connecting the dots? That's the fun part. If you're like me, you get the sense the wizarding world hasn't mastered soul magic at all. They've just stumbled onto a bunch of incompatible hacks. Horcruxes are this fringe ritualized hack passed down in whispers. Obscurials are the accidental hack, a side effect of magical trauma that nobody really understands. The Kiss is the institutional hack, weaponized by the ministry because someone realized Dementors already do soul removal for free. Once you see it that way, you start noticing other places where the soul gets nicked around the edges. Personality changes after near-death experiences. Harry literally comes back with a piece of Voldemort in his head, and everyone's just like, wow, he's good at Parseltongue now. Long-term Dementor exposure in Azkaban turns people into empty husks even without the Kiss. It's like slow-motion soul erosion. And repeated memory charms. We watch Lockhart erase himself with a backfired spell. But what about people like the Ministry Obliviators doing that stuff every day? Are they shaving off tiny bits of who their targets are each time, like magical brain sandpaper? I mean, come on. You cannot convince me nobody in history ever tried to systematize this. We get hints that older, darker disciplines existed. Azkaban started as some rando dark wizard's fortress where Dementors flocked to his experiments. Blood magic is quietly everywhere, from Lily's protection to Voldemort weaponizing Harry's blood. You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling has said creating a Horcrux needs a specific, unnamed spell. Somebody researched that. So where did the rest of that research go? My read is that any serious, systematic study of the soul either got buried, burned, or locked in a Department of Mysteries filing cabinet, because it makes one thing embarrassingly clear. A lot of normal wizarding practices are casually soul-damaging. And if there was ever a group obsessed enough, ruthless enough, and well-placed enough to explore those lost disciplines, it wasn't just Voldemort. It was the secretive families and institutions that outlived him. And that brings us to the uncomfortable part. A lot of that lost soul magic isn't lost at all. It's just sitting in somebody's drawing room, pretending to be a family tree tapestry and a cursed music box. If you're like me, you grew up thinking of the Blacks, Gaunts, Lestranges, and Malfoys as colorful background villains with nice hair and bad politics. But look at how they're described. Ancient, noble, and with vaults and libraries that go back centuries. Grimmauld Place isn't just a creepy house, it's basically a private department of mysteries with better wallpaper. We see cursed lockets, a murderous family tapestry that literally edits people out of existence, and cabinets full of, "Don't touch that. It bites heirlooms." You might be asking yourself, how many of those things are just Horcrux-adjacent experiments that never quite worked? The Gaunts are the same energy, just rural and inbred. They treat the Peveril ring like a toy, casually passing around what is essentially a resurrection stone bomb, and they speak Parseltongue like it's a family accent. That implies generations of messing with snake magic, binding oaths, probably bloodline-only curses. The Lestranges? Bellatrix's vault is so stuffed with dark artifacts that one of them is literally the Cup of Hufflepuff, and nobody notices. I mean, come on. If you accidentally store a Horcrux, what's in the boxes we don't see? And pay attention to how often dark objects are called family heirlooms. The Hand of Glory, cursed opals, self-writing blood quills, portraits that remember everything great-grandfather ever did. That's not just decor. That's generational R&D and curses, binding magic, and soul-adjacent spells, all politely labeled as tradition. Voldemort didn't invent true darkness. He just rebranded Grandma's weird ritual notes with a cooler logo. But it's not just families. The institutions are in on it. Gringotts is supposedly the safest place in the world, and in case you've forgotten, that safety mostly means we will never, ever ask what you put in here. Azkaban started as one dark wizard's lair, so cursed that Dementors moved in and never left, and the Ministry looked at that and went, "Perfect prison real estate." Hogwarts has the Room of Requirement, quietly hoarding contraband for centuries, and Dumbledore just lets it cook. You don't have to take my word for it. The Wizengamot is packed with the same old families who own the vaults, sit on the boards, and write the laws about what counts as too dark, while storing the originals in their basements. So while Voldemort is gone, the infrastructure that built him, old money, old magic, old grudges, didn't go anywhere. It's still arranging marriages, funding research, and locking the really spicy stuff in unmarked vaults and sealed rooms, waiting for the next Tom Riddle to come along and read what he shouldn't. And if this is what the respectable side of wizarding society is sitting on, the final layers of the iceberg, lost grimoires, failed immortality rituals, and the things even Death Eaters wouldn't touch, are still waiting below. And speaking of things locked in unmarked vaults, we're going to finally talk about the big one. Horcruxes. In case you've forgotten, Half-Blood Prince gives us the classroom, PG-13 version via Slughorn. Murder splits the soul. You say a spell. You pop the little shard into a locket like it's a cursed USB drive, and boom, immortality. It's creepy? Sure, but it's also very tidy. The problem is, Rowling has straight up said that explanation is sanitized. She's talked about Horcrux creation needing a supremely evil act beyond murder, and admitted she didn't want to describe the full ritual on the page because it was too horrific for a kid's series. So Slughorn's sipping mead and gossiping about soul jars, and off-screen we're missing the worst part. You might be asking yourself, isn't murder already the worst part? And the answer is, not in this universe. Murder is the trigger, but it's not the whole mechanism. There has to be deliberate intent to rip your own soul, a specific spell, and usually this twisted emotional state that's closer to self-mutilation than just killing someone. You're not just ending a life, you're choosing to maim your own inner self on purpose and then staple the bleeding bit to an object. Rowling's refusal to spell it out is like a giant neon sign. Fans have filled in the blank with their own horror. Ritual torture of the victim to heighten the emotional damage. Cannibalism as a way of taking in death. Even sexual violence as the kind of taboo she'd never put in a children's book. We don't know which, if any, are right, and I'm not going to pretend we do. But the point is the same. Whatever happens between the murder and the spell is meant to feel spiritually obscene. And the cost doesn't stop at the ritual. Look at Voldemort's body over time. He goes from handsome Tom Riddle to snake-nosed corpse baby in King's Cross. He literally can't feel normal love, and his remorse is so atrophied that even at the end, he can't access it. Rowling said each Horcrux fragment is conscious on some level, which means these aren't just backup drives. They're cursed, screaming pieces of mind stuck in objects, experiencing time and whatever happens around them. If you're like me, that retroactively makes stuff we already saw way worse. The diary doesn't just show memories, it manipulates Ginny, feeds on her secrets, and slowly overwrites her personality. The locket amplifies every insecurity Harry, Ron, and Hermione have, like an emotional Dementor that also does possession. These things act like predators, not containers. They want attention. They want pain. And the series quietly tells you soul damage is a general rule, not a Voldemort-only DLC. Dementors eat away at your soul. The killing curse rips it out entirely. Memory charms like Lockhart's leave people permanently broken when they backfire. You don't have to take my word for it. Saint Mungo's is basically a museum of magical brain injuries. I mean, come on. Contrast that with how casually the topic comes up. Tom Riddle is asking about Horcruxes in a classroom. Slughorn is treating it like celebrity gossip. The academic tone is part of the horror. The people with the books and the language have managed to turn deliberate soul-maiming into an essay question. And Horcruxes are just one branch. If wizards can slice, store, and weaponize souls, what else can they do to a person without ever casting Avada Kedavra? The rest of soul magic, Obscurials, Dementors, and the ways you can be unmade without dying, is still waiting lower on the iceberg. So if Horcruxes are what happens when you choose to break your own soul, Obscurials are what happens when the world does it for you. In case you've forgotten the Fantastic Beasts lore because, you know, life happened. An Obscurial is a young witch or wizard who's forced to suppress their magic so hard that it kind of snaps. The bottled-up power peels off into this separate, parasitic cloud of rage and destruction called an Obscurus. It's literally your magic trying to claw its way out of your body, usually killing you before age 10. Fun? You might be asking yourself, how do you get one of these walking disasters? You don't volunteer. You get beaten, shamed, locked in cupboards, told that magic is evil, that you are evil. The Obscurus feeds on that fear and repression. It's not just a random curse, it's weaponized trauma. Grindelwald looks at Credence and sees a nuke. I look at Credence and see a kid whose coping mechanism turned into a murder cloud. And if you're like me, the second you heard that explanation, you went, "So? Ariana Dumbledore, right? We're told she's attacked by Muggle boys when they see her doing magic. She stops using magic, becomes unstable, has violent outbursts that she can't control, and the family responds with total secrecy and isolation." That is beat for beat the Obscurial profile. Wrong era, wrong terminology, same pattern. Fans have pretty much built an entire sub-genre of theory around Ariana was an Obscurial. And I mean, come on, it fits almost too well. If that's true, it means this phenomenon is at least a century old, probably way older. And it also means Dumbledore walks into Fantastic Beasts, already knowing exactly what Credence is. He's not just academically curious, he's watching a living reminder of the sister whose uncontrolled magic killed his mother and maybe his future with Grindelwald. Put that next to Horcruxes, and you start to see a really nasty symmetry. Horcruxes are deliberate soul-tearing. You commit murder. You perform some unnamed ritual. You slice off a chunk of yourself and hide it in a locket. Obscurials are forced soul-fracturing. Adults crush a child's identity until their magic rips away in self-defense. Different methods, same message. In this world, magic and selfhood are welded together, and when you damage one, the other shatters. And the moral angle is brutal. Obscurials are basically kids punished by their own magic for surviving abuse. The wizarding world's response? No therapy, no specialized healers, no protocols. Just, they die young. And, occasionally, what if we point them at a political enemy? You don't have to take my word for it. The canon literally never shows a successful, stable, obscurial treatment. This pattern isn't limited to kids with obscurices either. Look at Neville's parents after the Cruciatus curse, permanently broken, tucked away in St. Mungo's, everyone quietly moving on. Lockhart after his backfired memory charm, identity wiped, played as a gag, then abandoned. Magical trauma in this universe is rarely healed. It's warehoused. So the really dark lore isn't just in the forbidden section spells. It's in the way the system keeps generating broken souls, obscurials, dark wizards, Dementor food, and then politely erases them from the history books. And if the present looks like that, what do you think is buried in the older wars and the origins of places like Azkaban? We're going to drop another layer and look at the creatures and prisons that were built to feed on all this damage. So if the system is already chewing up individual witches and wizards, what happens when it decides an entire species is a problem? We're going to talk about the Ministry's favorite hobby, calling things monsters and then acting shocked when the monsters hate them. Start with giants. By the time Harry shows up, giants are basically a rumor with a postcode. Hagrid's like, in case you've forgotten, they used to live in the mountains. Now they're hiding in tiny remote colonies, half-starved and killing each other. You might be asking yourself, did they just naturally fade away? The books quietly say no. Hagrid mentions ministry raids, giants getting slaughtered, and Dumbledore being one of the only people who ever tried diplomacy instead of just sending in aurors with high-powered blasting curses. And the wild part is, the giant wars are barely even called wars. They're giant disturbances, giant problems in Europe, little throwaway lines that sound like bad weather reports. If you're like me, you read History of Magic chapters as a kid, and your brain just slid off all those goblin uprisings and giant campaigns. But those are centuries of conflict. Whole communities wiped out, shoved into mountains, then blamed when they ally with Voldemort because, shocker, the Ministry has been trying to exterminate them for generations. Same deal with goblins. Official history turns goblin rebellions into this running joke, like goblins just love being quirky and violent about interest rates. But the same textbooks also tell you goblins can't have wands, can't share political power, and every time they push back, the response is another crackdown. Goblins get framed as greedy and untrustworthy, and then punished for not trusting the people who literally wrote laws to keep them inferior. I mean, come on. Characters who actually live in the margins keep accidentally telling the truth. Hagrid hints at giant massacres. Lupin explains anti-werewolf legislation that makes it almost impossible for him to get a job. Firenze flat out says wizards are arrogant and will regret ignoring other beings. But Binns? Binns is like, anyway, 12 more goblin uprisings. Moving on. Werewolves get the worst of it. You don't have to take my word for it. The series literally names laws like the Werewolf Code of Conduct and anti-werewolf employment restrictions. The Ministry basically says, "You're dangerous, so we won't let you work," then acts surprised when some werewolves join Voldemort. That's not security policy. That's manufacturing your own paramilitary problem. Which is where Fenrir Greyback comes in as the nightmare feedback loop. He hears the "you're a monster" narrative and goes, "Cool, I'll be the scariest one." He targets children on purpose, infects them young, and builds a pack of people who can't ever fit into normal wizarding life because the laws were written to keep them out. It's terrorism as recruitment strategy. Once you see that pattern, the Ministry stops looking like a defense force and starts looking like an enemy factory. Label giants, goblins, werewolves as existential threats, hit them hard, then point to the backlash as proof you were right all along. And if that's what they admit to in living memory, what do you think the file on Dementors and Azkaban looks like? Who decided a soul-eating fortress was cost-effective, and what got erased to make that sound normal? So, Azkaban. The wizarding world looked at a nightmare fortress in the middle of a freezing storm ocean, infested with soul-eating wraiths, and said, "Prison problem solved." I mean, come on. That's not a correctional facility. That's a state-sponsored Dementor buffet with extra steps. In case you've forgotten, Azkaban isn't just a building. It's basically a vertical tomb stuck on a rock, permanently overcast, surrounded by icy water you can't swim, can't apparate into, can't fly to without immediately regretting your life choices. And every corridor is patrolled by creatures that literally feed on every happy memory you've ever had. You don't serve time in Azkaban. You marinate in your own worst thoughts until you're either dead or something that wishes it was. So where did these things come from? The books are cagey, but we know Dementors predate the Ministry and just kind of show up wherever there's enough misery. Rowling said they breed in despair and chaos, which means war, famine, political collapse. That's their idea of spring break. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself who looked at that and thought, you know what would be efficient? Hiring them. But that is exactly what the Ministry does. It cuts a deal with entities that are fundamentally hostile to human well-being because outsourcing cruelty is cheaper than building a humane justice system. And then we get to the Dementor's kiss, which is where the mask really slips. The kiss is the legal, on-the-books punishment of having your soul sucked out while your body keeps breathing. That is worse than murder. It's like bureaucratic lobotomy plus. Yet Fudge talks about using it on Sirius and Barty Crouch Jr. with the same energy as ordering extra security trolls. You don't have to take my word for it. The text has him casually approving a fate Dumbledore treats as a horror beyond death. The wild part is Azkaban itself already had a horror backstory. Rowling said it was originally a fortress used by a dark wizard whose experiments attracted Dementors long before the Ministry took it over. So they didn't cleanse it, dismantle it, salt the earth. They just walked into an existing torture site, slapped a logo on the front, and called it Corrections Policy. And look what that does to people. Long-term Dementor exposure doesn't just make you sad. It's written almost exactly like magical depression and PTSD. Bellatrix and the Lestranges come out gaunt, twitchy, voices cracked, minds fragmented around their obsession. Hagrid's brief stay leaves him barely functional. Azkaban is basically weaponized mental illness as architecture. Meanwhile, the same society that freaks out about dark magic harming the soul is fine employing creatures whose entire life cycle revolves around devouring happiness and, occasionally, the soul itself. That's some Olympic-level moral gymnastics, and the minute Voldemort shows up and says, "Hey, I'll give you more food, the Dementors bail. The whole prison system collapses because the guards were never loyal, just hungry. So if this is what the good guys sign off on in broad daylight, how much darker is the stuff they quietly buried, rewrote, or memory charmed out of existence once the war was over? So if the ministry is fine outsourcing law and order to soul-eating wraiths, you might be asking yourself, what are they doing behind closed doors when nobody's watching? Short answer: the same thing Dumbledore's doing, just with worse PR. Let's start with Albus. Not twinkly-eyed sherbet lemon grandpa. The guy playing 5D chess with children's lives. He withholds information from Harry, from Snape, from the Order, from pretty much everyone, because he's already decided what the winning timeline looks like. Harry has to grow up abused so the blood wards work. Harry has to walk into the forest and die. Snape has to stay miserable and loyal because guilt plus unrequited love is the perfect unbreakable leash. He literally calls Harry a pig for slaughter. Not metaphorically, out loud, to Snape. And the wild part is, by the time Harry hears the full truth about the Hallows, the Horcruxes, and Dumbledore's own mess of a past, every major choice has already been made. You can't exactly pause the Battle of Hogwarts and say, "Hang on, let's workshop other options." If you're like me, you read Deathly Hallows and went, "Wait, he knew about the Hallows this whole time and just didn't mention the unbeatable wand or the resurrection stone?" He sends 3 teenagers on a Horcrux scavenger hunt and forgets to include, "Oh, by the way, Voldemort accidentally made you into one, and you're going to have to die. But I've got this complicated ownership hack planned with Draco and Snape." That's not forgetful old man energy. That's controlled narrative energy. And the irony is brutal, because in case you've forgotten, young Dumbledore literally lived through the Grindelwald fiasco. Secret ideology meetings, big talk about the greater good. Ariana dead on the floor because nobody would tell the truth or back down. He knows exactly what happens when you mix secrecy with grand plans. Then he spends the next war quietly recreating that same dynamic on a global scale, just with better robes. Meanwhile, the Ministry is running its own spin campaign. In Order of the Phoenix, they're printing Harry is crazy headlines. Dolores is stapling educational decrees to the walls, and Dumbledore is public enemy #1. The second Voldemort shows up in the atrium where everyone can see. Instant pivot. Suddenly, they're the brave resistors who always suspected something was wrong. Rita Skeeter is the perfect bridge here. The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore is absolutely a hit piece, but it accidentally shows you how easy it is to rewrite a life with a few selective memories and a catchy title. You don't have to take my word for it. The whole wizarding public flips from Dumbledore the Defender to Dumbledore the Dark Past Enthusiast off one book and some headlines. And after the war, nobody sits down for a truth commission. Death Eaters mutter imperious curse and walk. Compromised officials slide back into their old jobs like it was an awkward gap year. No public reckoning about how early the Ministry knew about Horcruxes, or whether they ever poked at Obscurial cases after Ariana, or what kind of experiments they ran with Dementors when Azkaban first changed hands. I mean, come on. We don't even get an official body count. That's not an accident. When a society is this good at editing itself, you have to ask, how sanitized is the version we're reading? We're going to pull that camera back one more time and look at what this whole iceberg says about the story underneath the story. So when you pull the camera back like that, what do you actually see? In case you've forgotten, we started this whole iceberg with schoolyard stuff. Expelliarmus duels, silly jinxes, the Weasley twins weaponizing homework. Then it tilted into quirky laws and magical bureaucracy, and by the time we hit the bottom, we were talking Horcrux rituals, Obscurials, Dementor breeding patterns, and governments quietly airbrushing war crimes out of the history books. That's not just a tone shift. That's a map. Because if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, okay, is this just a bunch of disconnected, edgy trivia, or is it saying something about how this world actually works? And the through line is pretty brutal. The darkest magic almost never shows up as one cackling villain doing a bad thing in a vacuum. It shows up as systems that treat soul damage as an acceptable cost of doing business. Think about it. Horcruxes are the flashy example, but look around them. You've got Dementors institutionalized as prison guards. You've got blood wards turning Lily's sacrifice into a literal legal contract about where Harry is allowed to live. You've got unbreakable vows that don't just enforce promises, they kill you for breaking them. Magic here is never neutral. Every spell and contract bakes in a value judgment about whose life matters and what can be sacrificed. And in that context, Voldemort stops looking like the root problem and starts looking like the rash. He doesn't invent blood purity. He just turns the volume up on centuries of prejudice. Giants were already hunted. Werewolves were already unemployable. House elves were already magically shackled. He weaponizes fear of the unknown, but the fear was already policy. You don't have to take my word for it. The Ministry literally keeps using some of his tactics after he's gone, just with better branding. The personal tragedies we talked about aren't random lightning strikes. They're case studies. Ariana Dumbledore's implosion as a maybe Obscurial is what happens when a family is too scared of scandal to get her real help. Credence is what happens when a whole society tells magical kids their power is shameful. Neville's parents in St. Mungo's, Sirius rotting in Azkaban without a trial. That's what it looks like when institutions decide that actually facing their own darkness would be more inconvenient than losing a few people along the way. And sure, the text gestures at reform. Hermione starts SPEW Kingsley, becomes minister. Hogwarts reopens. The castle literally rebuilds itself. Everyone claps at the epilogue kids going off to school. But do we ever see a serious conversation about shutting down Azkaban? About what Dementors are or where they go? About giants, werewolves, goblins getting actual power? Not really. The machine keeps running. For me, that's the real horror of the wizarding world. How easy it is to move on. The war ends. The bodies get buried. The Dementors just drift off-screen. The secrets stay secrets, and we keep rereading it as a cozy nostalgia series. So what do we do with that? We're going to talk about what this means for how we read fantasy at all, and what it says about the stories we grew up trusting. So what do we do with that? We just spent hours climbing down from chocolate frogs and house points into soul mutilation, child weapons, and a government that literally rents despair ghosts. That is some emotional whiplash. You start with Bertie Bott's every flavor beans and you end with, oh, right. Azkaban is basically a state-approved torture island. Cool. When you zoom back out, some of the biggest reveals aren't even really reveals. They're things that were sitting in the text the whole time. Horcruxes stop being quirky evil MacGuffins and turn into this entire philosophy of what a soul is, what it costs to break it, and how the wizarding world quietly tolerates magic that should make everyone drop their wands and go home. Obscurials stop being a Fantastic Beasts side quest and become weaponized trauma, the logical endpoint of a culture that tells scared kids to shut up and hide their magic until it explodes. If you're like me, the Ministry hits different now too. All those regulations and security measures start to look like a monster factory. They take Azkaban from some cursed dark wizard's island, see the Dementors breeding in despair, and go, "Yeah, that's our new prison system. I mean, come on." And Dumbledore, in case you've forgotten, is not your cozy grandpa. He's the guy running long cons with blood magic, half-truths, and a child soldier who doesn't know he's a Horcrux-shaped chess piece. But here's the thing. That darkness is part of why the series sticks. You might be asking yourself why a kids' series about boarding school homework still lives rent-free in your brain. It's because the darkness was always there, just under the pumpkin juice. Every cozy Christmas at Hogwarts feels earned because you now know giants were purged, Dementors multiply in every war, and somewhere off-page, the Ministry is filing away another cover-up. So here's my slightly rude take. Loving Harry Potter doesn't mean pretending the wizarding world is wholesome. It probably means the opposite. It means you're willing to admit this place is messed up, and still find something real in the people who fight back anyway. Harry choosing mercy. Hermione trying to fix a system that keeps telling her to sit down. Even Snape weaponizing his own damage in a way that's not neat or pretty or easy to forgive. Next time you reread or rewatch, I want you to keep this whole iceberg in the back of your mind. Notice every throwaway line about giants being dealt with, every Dementor gliding past a kid on the Hogwarts Express, every time Dumbledore dodges a question and changes the subject. Ask yourself, what are they not telling us? You don't have to take my word for it. The weird little details are all right there. Now I want to hear your dark lore theories. Drop your favorite one in the comments. Tell me what layer of the iceberg I criminally underrated, and let me know which universe we're going to drown in next. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, something even more cursed. And send this to that one friend who still proudly knows their Hogwarts house and pretends they're over their Harry Potter phase. If this video does well, I'm very tempted to come back for the stuff we barely touched. Ilvermorny's weird history, Grindelwald's rise as an actual magical fascist, post-epilogue politics, all of it. Because if you think this iceberg was bad, wait until we start digging into the global wizarding world. So the next time you see that Hogwarts letter in your inbox, just remember, you're not just signing up for magic. You're signing up for the fine print.